Hello everyone. I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The Unseen Cartography. Chapter 1, The Logic of Space. The hiss of the large format scanner was a familiar lullaby to Owen Rees, a rhythmic counterpoint to the soft tap-tap-tapping of his keyboard and the gentle sigh of the Welsh wind against the stone walls of the Llangorreg Regional Planning Office. Here, amidst the scent of old paper, drying ink, and the faint, metallic tang of server racks, Owen found his sanctuary. His world was one of lines, coordinates, and the precise, unwavering logic of cartography. Owen, a man in his late 30s, was built like the cromlechs that dotted the hillside surrounding Llangorreg, solid, unassuming, and rooted. His dark hair, already flecked with premature gray at the temples, was usually neatly combed, though by day's end, a few rebellious strands might attempt escape. His glasses, perched on a nose that bore the mark of a childhood tumble, magnified eyes that missed little. He was a creature of habit, his life a well-drawn map with clearly defined routes and destinations. Monday to Friday, 9 a.m. to 5 p.m., was the planning office. Friday evenings, a pint of bitter and a game of darts at the Mariner's Rest. Sunday mornings, a brisk hike along the coastal path, regardless of the weather, the salt spray a welcome abrasive against his skin. His cottage, a converted smithy on the town's outskirts, was a testament to his nature, everything in its place, books on local history and cartographic theory arranged by size and subject, kitchen utensils hung in symmetrical perfection. He found solace in order, a deep, almost spiritual comfort in the knowledge that A always led to B, that longitude and latitude were immutable truths. Space, to Owen, was not an abstract concept, it was a tangible, measurable entity, a grand, intricate puzzle that, with enough care and attention, could be perfectly understood. Llangorreg itself was a town that seemed to defy such easy categorization. Nestled in a deep coombe on the Welsh coast, it was a place of winding, narrow streets that often ended abruptly or twisted back on themselves like startled adders. Grey stone houses, their slate roofs slick with perpetual damp, huddled together as if for warmth against the persistent sea mists that rolled in without warning, swallowing familiar landmarks and muffling sounds. Ancient ruins, the crumbling bones of forgotten chapels and fortifications, clung to the cliffs, whispering of a past that felt more present here than in most places. Llangorreg had a peculiar reputation amongst cartographers, its older maps were notoriously unreliable, riddled with discrepancies, phantom lanes, and strangely distorted perspectives. Llangorreg's whimsy, his old mentor used to call it, with a knowing smile. Owen, however, preferred to think of these as historical artifacts of less sophisticated survey methods, errors to be corrected and filed away. His current project involved digitizing a collection of 19th-century Ordnance Survey maps of the region, meticulously overlaying them with current GIS data to identify and catalog changes, discrepancies, and lost features for the municipal archive. It was slow, painstaking work, perfectly suited to his temperament. He would scan the vast, linen-backed sheets, then, on his dual monitors, trace the faint copperplate inscriptions, the delicate hachures indicating contours, the careful symbols for churches, mills, and public houses. It was on a Tuesday afternoon, the sky outside a bruised purple heralding another squall, that he first saw it. He was working on sheet LXXIV, surveyed 1888, a beautifully preserved map, its paper the color of old ivory, its ink still surprisingly crisp. His cursor hovered over a dense cluster of terraced houses near the old harbor, an area he knew well. And there, tucked between Shipwright's Row and the Old Custom House path, was a thin, almost apologetic line, labeled in tiny, spidery script, Groon Lane. Owen leaned closer, his brow furrowing. Groon Lane. The name was unusual for Llangorreg. Groen sounded Dutch, or perhaps an archaic form of green. He consulted his modern digital overlays, the meticulously accurate vector lines glowing on the adjacent screen. No Groon Lane. He switched to current paper street maps, then to aerial photographs. Nothing. Shipwright's Row flowed directly into the cobbled expanse behind the custom house. There was no intervening lane, no gap, no hint that one had ever existed. A minor prickle of curiosity, nothing more. Odd, he murmured, the sound swallowed by the hum of the office. He'd encountered ghost features before, proposed roads never built, misinterpretations by hurried surveyors, lanes absorbed by later developments. This was likely one of those. He made a note in his digital log, sheet LXXIV, 1888, Groon Lane, marked between Shipwright's Row and Old Custom House Path. Not present in current mapping. Probable historical error or subsequent demolition/absorption. He zoomed in on the 1888 map. Groon Lane appeared to be a narrow, cobbled passage, perhaps just wide enough for a cart, connecting the slightly higher ground of Shipwright's Row with the lower path leading to the quayside. It had no buildings marked along its short length, suggesting it was purely a thoroughfare. He compared it to an earlier map from 1842. There it was again, fainter, but undeniably Groon Lane. And on a tithe map from 1839, less detailed but showing property boundaries, a clear demarcation existed where Groon Lane should be, though unnamed. Interesting. A persistent error, then, across several decades. Or a feature that had vanished very thoroughly. He finished his work for the day, the thought of Groon Lane a minor chord in the symphony of his ordered mind. As he locked up the archive, the scent of floor polish and old radiators replacing that of paper and ink, he made a mental note. The area was on his usual route home if he cut through the old town. He'd take a quick look. Just to satisfy a professional curiosity. The Langeregg evening was closing in, the notorious fog rolling up the Coombe from the sea, thick as sheep's wool. Streetlights cast hazy, aureate halos, their light struggling to penetrate the grey blanket. The air was cold and damp, carrying the briny smell of the harbor and the faint, earthy scent of wet stone. Owen pulled his coat tighter, the collar scratching his neck. He navigated the familiar labyrinth of Langeregg's old town, his footsteps echoing unervingly in the narrow, fog-filled ginnels. He knew these streets like the lines on his own palm. Here was the bakery, its windows dark, the smell of yesterday's bread lingering faintly. There, the crooked archway leading to St. Cadoc's churchyard. He reached Shipwright's Row, a terrace of tall, narrow houses that had once belonged to the town's master boat builders. Their facades, grimed with centuries of salt and soot, leaned companionably against each other. At the end of the row, where Groon Lane should have branched off, was nothing but the solid, windowless stone wall of the adjacent property, a former chandlery now converted into holiday flats. The wall was old, its stones weathered and lichen-stained, showing no sign of a filled-in opening or a more recent construction. It flowed seamlessly into the cobbled surface that sloped down towards the old custom house path. Owen walked the length of the wall, running his hand over the cold, damp stones. He peered into the gloom, shining his phone's flashlight. Nothing. No gap, no seam, no indication that a lane had ever pierced this spot. He crossed to the other side of the custom house path and looked back. Again, just an unbroken expanse of ancient stonework and tightly packed buildings. Built over, then, he said to himself, his breath misting in the fog. Completely. Or the map was simply wrong about its precise location. It was the most logical explanation. Langeregg was full of such architectural amalgamations, centuries of building and rebuilding overlaying each other. Yet, a small, irrational part of him felt a flicker of, not disappointment, exactly, but a subtle unease. The lines on the old maps had been so definite. He prided himself on his ability to read the landscape, to see the ghosts of past geographies in the present. Here, the ghost was entirely absent. He shrugged it off. It was just a minor cartographic puzzle, an insignificant footnote in the town's long history. He had more important things to focus on, more pressing discrepancies to resolve in the archive. The fog seemed to press in closer, muffling the distant mournful cry of a foghorn from the estuary. He turned for home, the image of that thin, spidery line labeled Groon Lane replaying itself, unbidden, in his mind. It was just a line on an old map. Nothing more. He told himself this as he prepared his solitary supper of cheese on toast, and later, as he lay in bed, listening to the wind rattle his window frames. Just a line. An error. A forgotten, demolished passage. Perfectly normal. Perfectly explainable. But for the first time in a long while, the precise, unwavering logic of his world felt just a fraction of a degree off kilter. The map in his head, the one he used to navigate his life, had acquired a faint, almost invisible smudge, right where Groom Lane wasn't. Chapter 2, The Echo of a Footstep. The following days settled back into their familiar rhythm, yet the ghost of Groom Lane lingered at the edges of Owen's thoughts, an itch he couldn't quite scratch. He found himself, during moments of routine data entry, idly sketching its supposed trajectory on scrap paper, trying to reconcile its presence on the old maps with its absolute absence in reality. Still puzzling over that lost lane, Owen asked Mrs. Davies, the office administrator, her voice a cheerful counterpoint to the hushed reverence of the archive. She was a woman whose bright cardigans and even brighter smile were a constant source of warmth in the often stuffy planning office. She'd seen him staring intently at the 1888 map again during his lunch break. Owen managed a small smile. Just a minor discrepancy, Dillies. This town is full of them. Oh, tell me about it, she chuckled. My great-aunt Owen used to swear there was a secret passage from her cellar in Anchor Street straight down to the smuggler's caves. Never found a trace of it, mind, but she'd tell us children's stories that'd curl your hair. She winked. Langereg likes its secrets. Her words, meant to be light-hearted, resonated with an unexpected weight. Secrets. Owen preferred transparencies, truths laid bare on a well-drawn grid. He tried to bury the Groom Lane anomaly under a mountain of other, more verifiable discrepancies, misnumbered plots, shifts in parish boundaries, reclaimed marshland now housing estates. These were the bread and butter of his work, the comfortable, solvable puzzles. Yet, every so often, his gaze would drift back to the digital scan of sheet LXXIV, to that thin, insistent line. On Friday evening, as was his custom, Owen found himself at the Mariner's Rest. The pub was warm and noisy, a welcome contrast to the increasingly bleak weather. Rain lashed against the leaded windows, and the wind howled like a banshee around the chimney pots. He nursed his pint of old speckled hen, the murmur of local gossip and the clack of darts a comforting backdrop. Gareth Price, a retired fisherman with a face like a well-oiled boot and a memory as long as a winter night, was holding court by the fireplace. Owen usually enjoyed Gareth's tales of Langereg's past, filtering them for historical nuggets. And I tell you, that fog back in '73, it was so thick you couldn't see your own hand in front of your face. Old Tomos Williams swore he walked straight through the wall of the churchyard and out the other side, didn't even realize, till he was halfway down Chapel Hill. Laughter rumbled through the assembled drinkers. Owen smiled politely, but a strange thought surfaced, walking through walls. Impossible, of course. A fisherman's exaggeration. Later, as he walked home, the rain had eased to a persistent drizzle. The fog, however, remained, clinging to the narrow streets, making them feel even more constricted. He deliberately chose the route that took him past the supposed location of Groom Lane. The streetlights seemed dimmer tonight, their glow more diffuse, swallowed by the damp air. As he approached the end of Shipwright's Row, he slowed his pace. The solid stone wall of the old chandlery loomed before him, slick with rain. He stopped, just looking. The rational part of his brain chided him for his foolishness. There was nothing here. Then, he heard it. Or thought he heard it. A sound, faint and fleeting, like a single footstep on loose cobbles. Coming from the other side of the wall. Or, more precisely, from within the space where Groom Lane should have been. Owen froze, his heart giving an uncomfortable thump. He strained his ears. The only sounds were the drip of water from a gutter, the sigh of the wind in a nearby alley, and the distant, rhythmic clang of a loose halyard against a mast in the harbor. He shook his head. Imagination, he muttered. The fog, the lateness of the hour, Gareth's stories, his mind was playing tricks. There were flats on the other side of that wall, people moving about. Someone inside must have made a noise. But the sound hadn't felt like it came from inside a building. It had the distinct, open-air quality of a footstep in a narrow passage. A slight scuff, then the clink of a dislodged stone. He forced himself to walk on, his pace quicker now. The unease from Tuesday night returned, stronger this time, coiling in his stomach. He didn't look back. The next day, Saturday, was gray and blustery. Owen usually reserved Saturdays for errands and quiet work on his own historical map collection. But Groom Lane wouldn't leave him. He found himself pulling out every old map of Langeregg he owned, and his personal collection was extensive. He spread them across his living room floor, kneeling like a supplicant before these paper deities of place. The 1888 OS map. The 1842 survey. The 1839 tithe map. A much older, hand-drawn estate map from circa 1780, its lines faded and uncertain, but there, unmistakably, was a narrow gap, a passage, in roughly the same location, labeled simply, cut. And stranger still, on a navigator's chart from the early 17th century, primarily focused on the coastline and harbor entrance, a crude depiction of the town showed a tiny, almost symbolic break in the buildings in that area. It was consistently there, across nearly 2 centuries of mapping, by different hands, for different purposes. Then, sometime after the 1888 survey, it had vanished from the record, and seemingly from the earth itself. He returned to the office on Monday with a renewed, almost obsessive focus. He bypassed his assigned tasks, diving deep into the planning archives, searching for demolition orders, building permits, minutes from council meetings from the late 19th or early 20th century that might mention the closure or redevelopment of a lane in that specific area. He cross-referenced street directories, census records. Nothing. No official record of Groom Lane ever being formally closed, built over, or renamed. It was as if, after 1888, it had simply ceased to be acknowledged. "Owen, are you feeling all right?" Mr. Evans, the head of planning, peered over his cubicle wall, his expression a mixture of concern and slight impatience. "You've been very intense these past few days. Is that 1888 overlay causing particular trouble?" Owen felt a flush creep up his neck. "No, sir. Just chasing down a persistent anomaly. Trying to be thorough." "Thorough is good, Owen," Mr. Evans said, his tone implying a but. "But let's not get bogged down in historical minutiae that have no bearing on current planning. That new coastal erosion survey needs your input." Owen nodded, chastened. "Of course, Mr. Evans. Right away." He tried to focus on the erosion data, on contour lines and projected sea level rises. But his mind kept returning to the phantom lane, the impossible footstep. He started to feel a prickle of something akin to paranoia. Was he the only one who saw the inconsistency? Was he becoming like his mentor's caricature of the Langeregg eccentric, obsessed with a cartographic ghost? That afternoon, he found himself subtly altering his computer's calibration settings, checking the scanner for minute distortions. Even questioning the accuracy of the office's GPS reference points. He measured his own desk with a tape measure, then measured it again. The results were, of course, identical. He was checking the checkers, a sure sign, he knew, of an unsettled mind. The routine of his life, once a source of comfort, now felt like a fragile construct. The logic of space he revered seemed to be fraying at the edges, specifically around one small, non-existent lane in the oldest part of town. He began to dread his walk home, the part that took him anywhere near Shipwright's Row. He started taking longer, less direct routes, much to the confusion of his internal compass. The maps were supposed to be records of reality. But what if, he thought with a sudden, chilling clarity, reality itself was an unreliable narrator? What if the maps were recording something else entirely, something that could flicker in and out of existence, leaving only faint traces on old paper and an echo in the fog. That evening, driven by a compulsion he didn't fully understand, he found himself once again near the end of Shipwright's Row. The fog was thinner tonight, allowing the moonlight to cast long, distorted shadows. He didn't approach the wall directly. Instead, he stood across the narrow street, partially concealed in a darkened doorway, watching. Waiting. For what, he didn't know. The street was deserted. The silence was profound, broken only by the distant moan of the sea. He felt foolish, a grown man lurking in the shadows, spooked by an old map and a trick of his own hearing. He was about to turn away when he saw it. Not a sound this time, but a visual distortion. For a fraction of a second, the solid stone wall of the old chandlery seemed to shimmer. Just a flicker, like heat haze rising from tarmac on a summer's day, but this was a cold, damp night. The lines of the stonework appeared to waver, to lose their solidity. The moonlight glinting off the wet surface seemed to bend, to refract in an impossible way. He blinked, thinking it was a trick of the light, an effect of the shifting fog. But the air was relatively clear here. He stared, his breath catching in his throat. The wall was solid again, implacable. Had he imagined it? Stress. Lack of sleep. He'd been poring over maps for hours, his eyes strained. That had to be it. But the image was seared into his mind, that brief, terrifying moment when the immutable boundary of stone and mortar had seemed on the verge of dissolving, hinting at something else, something other, lying just beyond the veil of the seen world. Groom Lane. Not just a line on a map, but a place trying to insist on its own existence, a place that flickered at the very edge of perception. Owen retreated, a cold dread seeping into his bones, far colder than the Welsh night air. The initial anomaly was no longer easily dismissible. It was beginning to stare back. Chapter 3, The Unreliable Landmark. The image of the shimmering wall, the impossible footstep, the persistent ghost of Groom Lane on antique parchments, these were no longer isolated curiosities for Owen. They were the first tremors of an earthquake that threatened to bring down the carefully constructed edifice of his reality. Sleep offered little respite, his dreams a chaotic jumble of shifting perspectives and maps whose coastlines writhed like eels. He'd wake with a jolt, the names of phantom streets on his lips, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against the silence of his cottage. The anomalies began to metastasize, spreading from the focal point of Groom Lane to infect his broader experience of Langeregg. He was reviewing a recent batch of digital updates for the council's public-facing GPS system when he first noticed a more contemporary discrepancy. A newly logged route for a scenic coastal walk, input by the tourism board, showed a small access path, Seaview Steps, branching off near the old lighthouse. Owen knew that area well, he'd walked it countless times. There were no Seaview Steps. He cross-referenced with the latest Ordnance Survey maps, both paper and digital, and his own extensive archive of aerial photography. Nothing. Yet, the GPS trace was clear. A thin blue line confidently asserting the existence of a path that, as far as any physical record or his own memory could attest, was pure fiction. He marked it for verification, a knot of unease tightening in his stomach. It was one thing for a 19th century map to contain an error, it was another entirely for brand new GPS data, supposedly ground truth, to invent geography. That same week, while working on a property boundary query, he pulled up the deeds and survey plans for a row of Victorian townhouses on Albion Terrace. He'd consulted these records before. But as he compared a plan from 1905 with a recent survey from 2018, he frowned. The overall dimensions of the terrace were the same, but the positioning of number 7, the property in question, seemed to have shifted almost imperceptibly eastward on the newer plan, by perhaps a foot and a half, relative to its neighbors. He checked the adjacent properties. Their frontages seemed fractionally, almost immeasurably, wider on the 2018 survey to accommodate this subtle drift. Impossible, he muttered, rubbing his eyes. He pulled up a third survey from the 1950s. On that one, number 7 was positioned somewhere between the 1905 and 2018 locations. It was like observing continental drift on a ludicrously small, impossibly accelerated scale. He meticulously checked the datum points, the benchmarks, the scale. Everything was technically correct within each individual document. But when overlaid, they told a story of a building that refused to stay entirely put. He blamed fatigue, eye strain. The constant, low-level hum of the office servers, usually a comforting background noise, now seemed to throb with a dissonant frequency. He started taking more frequent breaks, walking to the window and staring out at the familiar Langeregg skyline, trying to anchor himself. But even the view seemed subtly off. Had the spire of St. Cadoc's always been quite so dominant from this angle? Were the chimney pots on the distant rooftops always arranged in that precise configuration? His walks, once a source of mental clarity, became exercises in creeping dread. Houses he passed daily seemed to stand slightly further apart than he remembered, the gaps between them subtly wider, the gardens infinitesimally longer. The effect was cumulative, a slow stretching of familiar spaces that left him feeling disoriented and vaguely nauseous. The most jarring incident occurred one Tuesday evening. He left the planning office at his usual time, the Langeregg sky already bruising towards twilight. He decided to take his customary shortcut home, a 10-minute walk through a network of old alleyways and ginnels he knew like the back of his hand. He was preoccupied, his mind still wrestling with the shifting townhouse and the phantom Seaview steps. He walked, lost in thought, his feet carrying him along the familiar route. Yet, when he emerged onto his own street, expecting to see his cottage a few doors down, he was shocked to find himself much further away, near the junction with the main road. He checked his watch. 25 minutes had passed. 25 minutes for a walk that had never, in all his years in Langeregg, taken more than 10. He stared around, bewildered. He hadn't deviated. He hadn't stopped. He hadn't felt any sense of being lost or taking a wrong turn. The alleyways had felt longer. The cobbled surfaces underfoot had seemed to extend, the turns less frequent. It was as if the very fabric of the route had been subtly elongated, stretched like taffy, without his conscious awareness. Overwork, he told himself, his voice hollow. Stress. I'm tired. I must have wandered. But he knew, with a sickening certainty, that he hadn't. His internal compass, usually so reliable, felt wildly uncalibrated. Back in his cottage, the comforting order of his meticulously arranged belongings seemed like a fragile defense against an encroaching chaos. He began to document the anomalies, not in the official office logs, but in a private journal, a cheap, lined notebook he bought from the corner shop. He wrote down the date, the time, the specific discrepancy, his handwriting small and precise, a desperate attempt to impose logic on the illogical. October 26, Albion Terrace, number 7. Apparent eastward shift across surveys, 1905, 1950s, 2018. Approximate, 1.5 feet total. Rechecked all scales and benchmarks. No apparent error in individual documents. How? October 28, GPS anomaly, Seaview Steps near Lighthouse. No physical or historical record. Tourism Board insists data is correct, logged by summer intern using standard GPS tracker. Intern no longer available for query. November 2nd, walk home via Old Mill Alleyway. Usual duration, 10 to 12 minutes. Actual duration, 25 minutes. No deviation from route. Subjective experience of extended pathway. Fatigue? Or is space itself becoming elastic? The act of writing it down provided a temporary illusion of control, but the list grew longer, each entry a fresh stab of unease. He started carrying a small tape measure and a compass with him, remnants of his old surveying kit. He'd surreptitiously measure the width of pavements, the distance between lampposts, the angles of street corners, comparing his findings to official records or his own past memories. The discrepancies were always tiny, often within what might be considered a margin of error. But they were consistent. And they were always in the direction of more distance, more time, more space where it shouldn't be. Or, in the case of Groom Lane, less. Langeregg, his familiar, knowable town, was beginning to feel like a cleverly designed optical illusion, a stage set where the props were subtly rearranged when he wasn't looking. The logic of space, his lifelong creed, was crumbling. In the midst of this growing personal turmoil, a new temporary staff member joined the archives section, Nia Evans, a bright, enthusiastic postgraduate history student from Cardiff University, tasked with helping to catalog and restore some of the more fragile antiquarian maps under Owen's supervision. She was a breath of fresh air in the often stuffy atmosphere of the planning office, her dark, curly hair usually escaping its pins, her laughter quick and infectious. Owen, despite his preoccupation, found her presence initially a welcome, grounding distraction. She was fascinated by the old maps, her questions sharp and insightful. "It's like peeling back layers of time, isn't it, Mr. Reese?" she said one afternoon, her brow furrowed in concentration as she carefully humidified a brittle 18th century estate plan. "Seeing how the town used to breathe and grow." Owen, caught off guard by her directness and genuine passion, managed a weak smile. "Something like that, Nia." For a moment, he felt a flicker of his old self, the cartographer excited by the stories paper could tell. But it was quickly extinguished by the cold shadow of Groom Lane and the multiplying anomalies. The town wasn't just breathing and growing, it was actively misbehaving. And he was increasingly terrified he was the only one who could see it. Chapter 4, The Unseen Angle. Owen's private journal filled with increasingly agitated entries. The subtle, nagging inconsistencies were no longer ignorable, no longer easily attributable to stress or fatigue. He began to feel as though he were trapped in a slowly distorting room, the walls subtly warping, the floor tilting by imperceptible degrees. His use of the tape measure and compass became less surreptitious, more compulsive. He'd spend his lunch breaks remeasuring sections of the office corridors, the dimensions of his own cubicle, even the width of the pavement outside. Dilys Davies shot him worried glances, but said nothing, her usual cheerfulness tempered by a new caution when she approached him. The data he collected was maddening. A corridor that measured 15.7 meters one day might be 15.78 the next. A shadow cast by the old market cross in the town square at noon would fall at a slightly different angle than his meticulously calculated solar charts predicted, an angle that suggested either the sun was misplaced or the cross itself had minutely shifted its orientation. The deviations were always small, always within the realm of plausible deniability, a slight sag in the tape, a tremor in his hand holding the compass, atmospheric refraction affecting the light. But Owen knew. His training, his entire career, was built on precision. These weren't errors, they were symptoms. One particularly unsettling discovery occurred in Draper's Alley, a narrow, perpetually shadowed passage that ran behind the main shopping street. Owen often used it as a shortcut. He'd always found its claustrophobic atmosphere vaguely disquieting, but now it took on a more sinister aspect. He noticed that the shadows cast by the jutting upper stories of the buildings on either side didn't quite align with the angles of the walls. They seemed deeper, sharper, falling as if from sources of light that weren't present, or from architectural planes that didn't visibly exist. He stood there for a long time, staring, trying to make sense of it. Then, his gaze traveled up the brickwork of one of the buildings. It was an old warehouse, converted into flats. 3 visible sides, facing the alley and the streets at either end. But as he stared at the corner where the alley wall met the rear of the building, he had the distinct, stomach-churning impression of a 4th side, a plane that was not quite there, angled slightly away from Euclidean expectation. It was as if the building occupied a fraction more space than it should, its rearmost corner receding into a dimension his eyes couldn't fully process, only hint at through the bizarre behavior of light and shadow. He felt a wave of dizziness and leaned against the opposite wall, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps. Non-Euclidean. The term, once an abstract mathematical concept, now felt chillingly immediate, a potential descriptor for the creeping insanity of his surroundings. He tried to discuss some of his less outlandish observations with Nia, hoping her fresh perspective, her historian's eye for the anomalous detail in records, might offer some rational explanation, or at least validation. Nia, he began one afternoon, trying to sound casual as they worked together on a particularly fragmented map of Langeregg Harbor from the 1700s, have you ever noticed anything odd about the older building surveys? Slight discrepancies in how they're sited, almost as if they've shifted over time. Nia looked up from her delicate work with a conservation scalpel, pushing a stray curl from her forehead. You mean like subsidence, Mr. Reese? Or just old, inaccurate surveying? Some of these early cartographers were more artist than scientist, weren't they? She smiled. My great-uncle Ianto used to swear his garden wall at the back of his cottage in Leyden kept sliding downhill a few inches every year. Said the fairies were moving it. Drove my great-aunt Barrow mad. She chuckled at the memory. He was a character, Uncle Ianto. Full of old tales. Owen seized on her words. Sliding? Did he ever measure it? Did anyone else notice? Nia seemed a little surprised by his intensity. Oh, I don't know. I was just a kid. He'd show us where he'd put little chalk marks, and then a few months later, the edge of the wall would be past them. Probably just the land settling, you know. It's a steep hill there. He used to say the house itself sighed at night. Langeregg houses are full of groans, aren't they? She shrugged, returning to her map. He was probably just winding us up. He loved a good story. She brushed it off as an amusing family anecdote, a piece of harmless local eccentricity. But for Owen, it was another piece of the terrifying puzzle. A sliding wall. Buildings that sighed. It echoed the subtle shifts he was observing, the feeling of a landscape that was not static, but subtly, unnervingly alive. He pressed her, but what if it wasn't just settling? What if places can actually move, Nia? Subtly. What if the maps aren't just recording a fixed reality, but a fluid one? Nia paused, her smile fading. She looked at him properly now, and he saw a flicker of concern, perhaps even unease, in her eyes. Mr. Reese, are you feeling all right? You seem very focused on this. He realized he'd said too much, revealed too much of the obsessive anxiety that was consuming him. He saw the shift in her expression, the careful neutrality that people adopt when confronted with something they don't understand and instinctively want to distance themselves from. Just a thought, he mumbled, turning back to his own work, a cold sense of isolation settling over him. Professional curiosity. But Nia's anecdote, far from reassuring him, only deepened his conviction. Uncle Ianto's sliding wall wasn't just a quaint story, it was another data point, another whisper from the unsettling heart of Langeregg. The town was riddled with these spatial quirks, these subtle impossibilities, and most people, like Nia, dismissed them, rationalized them, or simply didn't see them. But Owen saw them. He couldn't stop seeing them. And the patterns they formed were leading him towards a conclusion too monstrous to contemplate. He began to suspect that Groon Lane wasn't an isolated phenomenon. It was merely the most blatant manifestation, the epicenter of a wider, more insidious spatial instability that permeated the very stones and streets of Langeregg. The town itself was the anomaly. And he, with his cartographer's eye, was uniquely, terribly attuned to its subtle, terrifying frequency. Chapter 5, The Unmaking of a Man. Owen's attempts to engage Nia further on the topic of Langeregg's spatial peculiarities were met with polite but firm evasion. She'd change the subject, or find a reason to be busy elsewhere in the archive. The easy camaraderie they had briefly shared evaporated, replaced by a careful, professional distance. He saw her watching him sometimes, when she thought he wasn't looking, her expression a mixture of pity and apprehension. He was becoming, that strange Mr. Reese, the obsessive archivist teetering on the edge. The isolation he had felt before now became a suffocating blanket. He had no one to confide in, no one who would understand or believe the increasingly bizarre reality he inhabited. His journal was his only confidant, its pages filled with frantic measurements, unsettling observations, and increasingly desperate questions. November 15th, measured the high street again. From the War Memorial to the corner of Bank Lane. Added 3.5 inches since last Tuesday. Or is my tape stretching? Check tape against steel rule. Tape is accurate. The street is longer. It has to be. November 18th, the shadows in Draper's Alley. They are definitely wrong. Took photographs. They show nothing unusual. Just shadows. But I saw it. The camera lies. Or it can't see the truth. Is the lane blinding technology to its true nature? The thought that even his attempts at objective documentation could be manipulated by the phenomenon, or by his own fracturing mind, was a new torment. If he couldn't trust his instruments, his photographs, what could he trust? Only his senses. But his senses were screaming that reality was a lie. His psychological state continued its downward spiral. Sleep deprivation gnawed at his coherence. Anxiety was a constant thrumming beneath his skin. He developed a nervous tic, a constant rubbing of his thumb against his forefinger, as if trying to smooth out some invisible wrinkle in the fabric of space. He ate erratically, his appetite lost to the gnawing dread. The environment of Langereg, once familiar and comforting, now felt actively malevolent. The winding streets seemed to conspire to disorient him, the fog to deliberately obscure his path. The old stone buildings, with their leaning facades and shadowed recesses, appeared to watch him with a silent, ancient cunning. He began to feel that the spatial trickery was not random, but directed, a conscious effort by some unseen intelligence to unhinge him, to break him down. One afternoon, Nia found him staring intently at the 1888 Ordnance Survey map of Langereg, the one that had first shown him Groen Lane. His face was pale. His eyes wide and unfocused. "Mr. Reese," she ventured, her voice soft. "Are you looking for something specific?" Owen didn't look up. He pointed a trembling finger at a section of the map near the harbor. "The pump," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "The water pump. It was here. I know it was. At the junction of Shipwrights Row and Pilchard Alley. I've seen it 100 times on this very map." Nia leaned closer, her brow furrowed. "A water pump? I don't see one marked there, Mr. Reese. Are you sure you're not thinking of a different map? Or perhaps it was on a later edition?" "No," Owen insisted, his voice rising with a desperate edge. "This map. This exact sheet. It was here. I photocopied it weeks ago, when I first started looking into discrepancies. The pump symbol was there on the photocopy." He scrabbled through a pile of papers on his desk, his movements jerky and uncoordinated, finally pulling out a creased photocopy. He smoothed it out, his finger jabbing at the paper. "See. There it is. The symbol. Clear as day." He then pointed back to the original 1888 map. "And now, look. It's gone. Vanished. The paper is undisturbed. No erasure. It's just not there anymore." Nia stared from the photocopy to the original map, then back again. A look of profound unease crossed her face. She could see the symbol on the photocopy. She could see its absence on the original map. There was no logical explanation. "Mr. Reese," she began slowly, her voice laced with a fear she could no longer conceal, perhaps you should go home. You don't look well." I can finish up here for today." Owen looked at her then, and she saw the full extent of his unraveling. His eyes were haunted, filled with a terror that was almost palpable. "You see it, don't you?" he whispered. "It changed. The map changed." Nia took a step back, instinctively. I think you're very tired, Mr. Reese. Please. You need to rest. That was the last time Nia Evans spoke to Owen Reese with any semblance of collegiality. The next day, she requested a transfer to a different department, citing an unexpected opportunity to work on a project more aligned with her primary research interests. Owen knew the real reason. He had shown her a glimpse of the abyss, and she had, quite sensibly, recoiled. Her departure cemented his isolation. He was alone with his impossible knowledge, with the terrifying certainty that the very records he had dedicated his life to were as fluid and unreliable as the shifting fogs of Langereg. The unseen cartography was not just about lost lanes or subtly moving buildings. It was about the fundamental instability of perceived reality, a reality that could be edited, rewritten, by forces unknown. The disappearing pump symbol was a turning point. It was no longer just his perception of space that was being assailed, but the recorded memory of space. If the maps themselves could be altered, then history itself was mutable. There was no fixed point, no reliable anchor. He stopped trying to rationalize. He stopped blaming fatigue or stress. He knew, with a cold, hard certainty that settled deep in his bones, that something was terribly, fundamentally wrong with Langereg, or perhaps with the world itself. And Groen Lane, the initial anomaly, was the key, the gateway to understanding, or to utter madness. His obsession, once a quiet hum in the background of his life, now consumed him entirely. He had to go back to the lane. He had to confront it. He had to know what lay beyond that solid, unyielding, yet utterly deceitful wall at the end of Shipwright's Row. The mundane world had become a prison of shifting perspectives and unreliable landmarks. Perhaps, he thought with a chilling surge of desperate resolve, the only way out was through. Chapter 6, The Cartography of Oblivion. Nia's departure was a quiet severing, the last tie to a world that still, however tenuously, adhered to the principles of consensual reality. Owen was adrift now, his compass spinning wildly, his maps offering no solace, only further proof of the encroaching insanity. The vanishing pump symbol on the 1888 Ordnance Survey map was not an end, but a horrifying beginning. If the official record could be so easily unwritten, what of older, more fallible chronicles? He abandoned all pretense of his regular duties at the planning office. Mr. Evans' concerned calls went unanswered. Dilys Davies left worried voicemails, her cheerful lilt strained with genuine fear for him. He barely registered them. His world had shrunk to the confines of his increasingly chaotic cottage and the Langereg archives, specifically its deepest, dustiest, most neglected corners. He was hunting for ghosts in the ink, for echoes of the unseen cartography in the brittle pages of history. He burrowed into parish maps from the 17th and 18th centuries, documents drawn by hand with painstaking, if often imprecise, detail. Here, the anomalies were not subtle shifts of a few feet, but yawning chasms in the known geography of Langereg. Entire districts, clearly delineated with street names and property boundaries, Weaver's Croft, Old Saltgate Ward, St. Brannoc's Close, appeared on these ancient charts, yet had no corresponding presence in later maps or any documented history he could find. They were phantom limbs of the town, amputated by time, or perhaps, by something else. Conversely, some well-established areas of modern Langereg were simply absent on these older maps, blank spaces where thriving communities now stood. A terrifying pattern began to emerge as he cross-referenced maps across the centuries. It wasn't just Groen Lane that flickered. Streets, paths, even significant buildings, would appear on maps for a generation or two, sometimes even a century, then vanish without a trace from subsequent cartography, only for some to reappear, perhaps slightly altered, decades or even centuries later. It was as if Langereg itself were a palimpsest, constantly being erased and rewritten, its spatial memory fluid and unreliable. The most chilling discovery came not from a map, but from a small, leather-bound journal tucked away in a mislabeled archive box of 19th-century municipal correspondence. It was anonymous, the handwriting spidery and increasingly agitated, dated between March 1840 and October 1841. The author, Owen deduced from internal references to surveying projects and council meetings, was likely a former town planner or surveyor, one of his own predecessors. The early entries were mundane, notes on drainage, road repairs, boundary disputes. But as the journal progressed, a creeping sense of unease, then outright terror, bled into the meticulous script. June 14, 1840, surveyed the north fields for the proposed new workhouse. The old right-of-way, Pinner's Path, which I have walked 100 times and is clearly marked on the 28 tithe map, was not to be found. The hedgerows have thickened. The land itself seems to have swallowed it. September 3, 1840, measured the frontage of the new corn exchange. My figures do not tally with those of Mr. Ainsworth from last spring. His plans show a frontage of 66 feet. Mine, taken thrice, show 64.5. The building has not shrunk. The street itself feels compressed. Madness. January 10, 1841, I begin to fear for my senses. The town is not fixed. It breathes. I have seen alleys narrow and widen overnight. I have felt the cobbles shift beneath my feet as if the very earth is restless. The maps lie, or they try to capture a truth that is constantly in flux. And then, the entry that made Owen's blood run cold, a sentence scrawled in a desperate, almost illegible hand near the end of the journal. October 5, 1841, they say the fog is to blame. But it is not the fog. It is the land itself. The land folds and breathes. It rearranges itself according to an older, deeper design. The map forgets because the land remembers. And what it remembers is not for us to know. I fear Langeregg is not built. The journal ended abruptly a few pages later, the final entry a single, shaky word, lost. Owen stared at the phrase, the map forgets because the land remembers. It resonated with a terrible, profound truth. The unseen cartography wasn't an error, it was the land's memory, bleeding through the thin veneer of human order. Groon Lane, the shifting buildings. The phantom districts, they were echoes of this deeper, more ancient reality. He photocopied the journal pages with trembling hands, the words of his 19th-century counterpart a chilling validation of his own descent. He was not the first to witness this spatial insurgency. He was merely the latest. His psychological decay accelerated. Sleep became a battlefield he rarely won. When he did succumb to exhaustion, his dreams were of impossible geometries, of endless, shifting corridors, of being trapped inside a map that was constantly redrawing itself. He would wake up gasping, unsure of where, or even when, he was. The hallucinations began, insidious and terrifyingly convincing. He'd walk into his living room and it would seem subtly larger, the ceiling higher, the far wall more distant than it had been an hour before. He'd blink, and it would snap back, or perhaps, not quite. The dimensions of his own cottage became fluid, untrustworthy. Mirrors became objects of dread. One morning, bleary-eyed and unshaven, he glanced into the bathroom mirror and froze. Reflected behind him, where the blank wall of the landing should have been, was a narrow, spiraling staircase, its steps disappearing into shadow. He whirled around. Nothing. Just the familiar, faded wallpaper of the landing. He looked back at the mirror. The staircase was still there, a silent, impossible invitation. He smashed the mirror with a shaking fist, shards tinkling into the sink, the image of the phantom staircase fracturing into a dozen mocking reflections. His cottage, his last sanctuary, began to actively betray him. One evening, he went to look out of his kitchen window, a window that had, for the 10 years he'd lived there, overlooked his small back garden and the fields beyond. Tonight, it faced a narrow, cobbled alleyway he had never seen before, its grimy brick walls pressing in, a single, flickering gas lamp at its far end casting long, dancing shadows. He felt a scream build in his chest, but it died as a strangled gasp. He backed away from the window, his heart hammering. He didn't dare look out again that night. By morning, the view was of his garden again, dew-kissed and placid, as if the alley had been nothing more than a nightmare. But he knew. The land was remembering. And it was remembering him. Chapter 7, The Mobius Road. The realization that his own home was no longer a fixed point in space, but a participant in Langereg's fluid geography, shattered Owen's last vestiges of resistance. He had to get out. He had to escape Langereg, escape the unseen cartography that was relentlessly unmaking his mind and his world. He threw a few clothes haphazardly into a bag, grabbed his car keys, and fled his cottage without a backward glance. He didn't know where he would go, only that it had to be away from this town where reality had become a malevolent, shifting dream. He drove, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white. He took the main A road heading east, the road that should have led him inland, towards sanity. The fog was unusually light for a Langereg morning, and for a brief, desperate moment, he felt a surge of hope. But Langereg was not ready to let him go. After 20 minutes of driving, by which time he should have been well clear of the town's immediate environs, he saw a familiar landmark ahead, the old, abandoned Dragon's Tooth petrol station, its paint peeling, its pumps rusting. He frowned. He'd passed it already, hadn't he? Or was there another, identical one further along the road? He drove on, his unease growing. The landscape seemed subtly repetitive, the curves of the road, the arrangement of trees and hedgerows, all having a disquieting familiarity. His car's GPS, which he'd switched on in a desperate attempt to orient himself, began to behave erratically. The blue dot representing his car stuttered, then showed him driving in circles, even when he was certain he was on a straight stretch of road. Street names appeared on the screen that he didn't recognize, names that belonged to no known map of this region. Another 10 minutes passed, the engine humming, the miles supposedly accumulating. And there it was again. The Dragon's Tooth petrol station, identical in every detail, right down to the faded, closed sign swinging crookedly in the breeze. Owen slammed on the brakes, his car skidding to a halt on the gravel shoulder. He stared at the petrol station, his breath coming in ragged gasps. This was impossible. He wasn't just lost, he was trapped. The road was a loop, a Mobius strip, endlessly returning him to this cursed landmark. Panic, cold and sharp, clawed at his throat. He tried to turn the car around, to head back towards Langereg, thinking perhaps escape was only possible by acknowledging defeat. But the road behind him looked subtly different, the landmarks unfamiliar. He tried a side turning, a narrow lane that, according to his increasingly unreliable memory, should have led to a small village. The lane twisted and turned, becoming progressively narrower, the hedgerows pressing in, until it petered out into an impassable, muddy track in the middle of a desolate, fog-shrouded field he didn't recognize. His phone had no signal. The GPS was now just a mess of flickering, nonsensical lines. He was a cartographer, a master of navigation, and he was utterly, terrifyingly lost, not in an unknown wilderness, but on the familiar roads just outside his own town. The unseen cartography was not confined to Langereg's ancient core, it had infected the surrounding landscape, turning escape routes into inescapable traps. Defeated, exhausted, on the verge of a complete breakdown, he managed, somehow, after what felt like hours of aimless, circular driving, to find his way back to Langereg. The town loomed out of the returning fog, its gray stone buildings seeming to watch him with a grim, knowing satisfaction. It had reeled him back in. He parked his car outside his cottage, his body trembling, his mind a maelstrom of fear and despair. He stumbled towards his front door, fumbling for his keys. He just wanted to collapse, to hide, to let the encroaching madness consume him in the relative familiarity of his own home. But his home had one last, horrifying surprise for him. As he reached the front door, he stopped dead. There, beside his familiar green-painted door, where yesterday there had been only the solid stone wall of his cottage, was another door. It was identical to his own in size and shape, but it was painted a stark, flat black. It had no knocker, no letterbox, just a simple, tarnished brass doorknob. It looked as though it had always been there, an integral part of the cottage's structure, yet he knew, with absolute, bone-deep certainty, that it had not. He stared at it, his mind reeling. Had he finally, completely, lost his grip on reality? Was this a hallucination, more vivid, more tangible than any before? Driven by a compulsion that overrode his terror, he reached out a trembling hand and touched the black door. It was cold, solid wood. He gripped the brass doorknob. It turned smoothly, silently, in his hand. With a sense of impending doom, he pushed the door open. It led into his kitchen. Or rather, a mirror version of his kitchen. Everything was there, the old pine table, the mismatched chairs, the dresser with its collection of chipped pottery, the window that, mercifully, for now, looked out onto his back garden. But it was all subtly warped. The angles were slightly off, the lines of the furniture and the walls seeming to curve and recede in ways that defied perspective. The colors were duller, tinged with a grayish, underwater quality. The air was colder, and there was a faint, persistent smell of damp earth and something else, something metallic and faintly sweet, a smell he was beginning to associate with the deepest anomalies. It was his kitchen, yet it was profoundly, terrifyingly other. As if he had stepped into a flawed reflection, a place where the rules of geometry were subtly different. Where the familiar had been twisted into the uncanny. He stood on the threshold, one foot in his known reality, the other in this warped echo. The silence in the mirrored kitchen was absolute, a dead, waiting stillness. This was not just a hallucination. This was real. The bleeding through was no longer confined to maps or fleeting perceptions. It had breached the final bastion. It was inside his home. It was inside him. The unseen cartography was no longer content to be observed. It was actively rewriting his world, line by line, door by door. And Owen Reese, its unwilling student, was trapped at the impossible intersection of two colliding realities. Chapter 8, The Land Remembers. The black door, the warped kitchen. Owen stumbled back from the threshold as if physically struck. He slammed the black door shut, the sound unnaturally muted, and leaned against the familiar green of his own front door, gasping for breath, his heart a frantic bird trapped in his ribs. For a wild moment, he thought of barricading the black door, piling furniture against it, pretending it wasn't there. But he knew, with a chilling certainty, that it would make no difference. The unseen cartography was not a physical intruder to be kept out, it was a fundamental shift in the nature of his reality. He spent the next few hours in a state of near catatonia, huddled on his living room sofa, wrapped in a blanket despite the cloying warmth of the unlit room. He was too terrified to move, too terrified to think. The journal of the 1841 planner lay open on the floor beside him, its words a bleak prophecy fulfilled: the map forgets because the land remembers. Langereg was remembering. And its memories were rewriting Owen's world. Slowly, as the initial shock receded, replaced by a numb, fatalistic dread, he began to explore his cottage. Or rather, what his cottage had become. The black door remained, an undeniable, malevolent presence in his hallway. He avoided it, skirting around it as if it were radioactive. The rest of the house, his familiar, ordered space, was now subtly, terrifyingly wrong. The window in his study, which had always offered a view of Mrs. Henderson's prize-winning roses next door, now looked out onto a dense, dark copse of trees he had never seen before, their branches skeletal and unnervingly still. The small crack in the plaster above his bedroom door, shaped vaguely like the coastline of Wales, was now a jagged, unfamiliar fissure that seemed to pulse with a faint, internal light. Rooms felt porous. He would walk into the spare bedroom, and for a fleeting moment, it would seem to connect to another, unseen space, a brief glimpse of a different wallpaper pattern, a different arrangement of furniture, before snapping back to its, mostly, familiar configuration. It was as if the walls themselves were flickering between realities, a dimensional bleed-through that was growing stronger, more insistent. He didn't dare look in any remaining mirrors. The most terrifying change was the silence. The familiar creaks and groans of his old cottage, the sounds he had lived with for a decade, were gone. Replaced by a profound, unnatural stillness, broken only by faint, unidentifiable whispers that seemed to emanate from the very walls, too faint to be words, more like the rustle of dry leaves or the sigh of distant water. And underlying it all, a barely perceptible, low-frequency hum, the same hum he had felt near Groon Lane before the wall had opened, the hum of the land itself, breathing, remembering. He knew he couldn't stay. But his earlier attempt to flee had proven the futility of escape. Langereg, or the force that animated it, had him in its grasp. He was a rat in a maze whose walls were constantly shifting. Driven by a desperate, almost suicidal curiosity, the last flickering ember of the cartographer within him, he found himself drawn back to the black door. He had to know what lay beyond the warped kitchen. If his reality was unmaking itself, he had to witness it, to map its dissolution. He took a deep, shuddering breath and opened the black door again. The warped kitchen was as he had left it, its angles skewed, its colors muted. The air thick with the scent of cold earth. This time, he stepped inside. The floorboards felt strangely soft underfoot, almost yielding, like packed soil. The silence was even more profound here, as if this mirrored space existed outside the normal spectrum of sound. He walked through the kitchen, his hand trailing along the cold, subtly curved surface of the pine table. Beyond the kitchen, where his small utility room should have been, was another doorway. It led into a corridor he didn't recognize, narrow and dark, its walls seemingly made of rough, unworked stone, slick with damp. The air grew colder. The faint, metallic sweet smell intensified. He followed the corridor, his footsteps echoing unnaturally in the oppressive stillness. It twisted and turned, descending gradually, the light from the warped kitchen fading behind him. He was navigating by touch now, his hands brushing against the cold, damp stone. He realized, with a fresh wave of terror, that he was no longer in his cottage. He was somewhere else. Somewhere, under. The corridor opened into a larger space, a cavernous chamber lit by a faint, phosphorescent glow emanating from strange, fungal growths clinging to the walls. In the center of the chamber, he saw it. A map. But not a map on paper. This map was alive. It was a vast, three-dimensional construct, a pulsating, shifting lattice of light and shadow, of lines that coalesced and dissolved, of geometries that defied human understanding. It was a representation of Langereg, but a Langereg he had only glimpsed in the anomalies, in the historical discrepancies, in the mad scribblings of the 1841 planner. This was the town's true form, its forgotten underpinnings, the unseen cartography made manifest. He saw Groon Lane, not as a simple passage, but as a glowing, throbbing artery in this living map. He saw the phantom districts from the ancient parish charts, their ghostly outlines flickering in and out of existence. He saw lines of energy connecting Langereg to other, distant places, unseen pathways crisscrossing the globe, a hidden network of spatial anomalies. And he saw himself, a tiny, insignificant figure standing at the edge of this terrifying, beautiful, impossible construct. A voice, ancient and resonant, echoed in the chamber, not from a single source, but from the living map itself. It was the same voice he had heard in his dreams, the voice of the land, the voice of Langereg. You seek to understand, cartographer. You seek to chart the unchartable. Owen sank to his knees, overwhelmed. What is this place? This is the memory. This is the truth beneath the lies of your paper maps. This is Langereg as it truly is, ever changing, ever folding, ever breathing. Why is this happening to me? He choked out. You looked too closely. You saw the stitches in the skin of the world. You have the sight. And Langereg. Langereg has chosen you. Chosen me for what? The living map pulsed, and a section directly in front of Owen shifted, reformed. A new pathway appeared, a glowing line extending from his feet into the intricate, terrifying heart of the unseen cartography. To remember. To record. To be its new mapmaker. The old one is lost. His ink ran dry. The voice hinted at the fate of the 1841 planner. The land needs a witness. A consciousness to hold its shape, however fluid. To navigate its forgotten ways. It was not an offer. It was a pronouncement. A sentence. Owen understood. This was his culmination. Not madness, not a breakdown, but an assimilation. He was being drawn into the unseen cartography, becoming a part of its living, breathing, terrifying structure. His meticulous obsession with maps, his love for the logic of space, had led him here, to a place where logic was an alien concept and space was an infinite, hungry maw. The glowing pathway beckoned. He knew, with a certainty that transcended fear, that if he took it, Owen Reese, the cartographic archivist, would cease to exist. He would become something else, an extension of this place, a sentient point on a living map. He thought of his ordered life, now a distant memory. He thought of Groon Lane, the initial anomaly that had unraveled everything. He thought of the 6 feet of unaccounted space. Perhaps here, in this place of impossible dimensions, those 6 feet, and all the other lost spaces of Langeregg, finally made sense. With a sigh that was half resignation, half a perverse, terrified curiosity, Owen Reese took the first step onto the glowing path. The living map surged around him, engulfing him in its cold, brilliant light, its chorus of whispers, its ancient, terrible memories. The land remembered. And now, so would he. Forever. Chapter 9, The Cartographer of Chaos. The glowing path within the living map did not lead Owen to a destination, but to a state of being. When he next found himself with a semblance of individual consciousness, he was back in his cottage, or what remained of its familiar iteration. The black door was still there, a sentinel of the impossible. The warped kitchen pulsed faintly with an unseen energy. But Owen himself was different. The terror had not vanished, but it was now overlaid with a vast, cold clarity. The chaotic visions, the disorienting shifts, the psychic whispers, they were no longer overwhelming. He could see the patterns now, the underlying structure in the madness. He was still Owen Reese, but his mind had been expanded, forcibly recalibrated to perceive the unseen cartography not as a series of terrifying anomalies, but as the fundamental truth of Langeregg. He found himself sitting at his large oak desk in the study, the one that had once been his sanctuary of order. Spread before him were not just his familiar maps, but the photocopies of the 1841 Planner's Journal, its desperate scrawls now resonating with a profound, shared understanding. He picked up the journal, his fingers tracing the frantic handwriting. He felt a strange kinship with this long-dead predecessor, another soul ensnared by Langeregg's spatial enigma. His gaze fell upon a page he had previously skimmed, a page near the end, where the planner's script had become almost a frantic series of symbols and diagrams. Tucked into the bottom margin, almost invisible beneath a blot of dried ink, was a small, hand-drawn sketch. It wasn't a conventional map. It was a complex, almost fractal-like diagram of overlapping, interpenetrating shapes, circles, spirals, and angular polygons that seemed to twist in on themselves. Lines connected these shapes, not in straight, Euclidean paths, but in sweeping, impossible curves that suggested movement through multiple dimensions or layers. At its heart, a dark, amorphous blot, labeled with a single, shaky word, core. The heart. Owen stared at the diagram, a jolt of recognition, or perhaps resonance, passing through him. This was not a map of Langeregg as it existed on any single plane of reality. This was a metamap, a conceptual blueprint of its shifting, layered existence. It showed how the different historical layouts, the phantom districts, the appearing and disappearing streets, were not truly gone or yet to be, but coexisted, bleeding into each other, facets of a single, complex, ever-changing topological entity. Langeregg was not static. It wasn't just built on the land, it existed within a dynamic, multi-layered spatial matrix. The maps humans drew, his maps, the Ordnance Survey's maps, even the ancient parish charts, were mere snapshots, single facets of an infinitely more complex jewel, attempting to impose a fixed, two-dimensional order on something inherently fluid and multidimensional. The land remembers, Owen murmured, the 1841 planner's words echoing in his mind. And this diagram, this metamap, was a glimpse into that memory, a sketch of the town's true, non-Euclidean soul. A new, consuming purpose filled him, eclipsing the fear, the despair. He had to understand this metamap. He had to chart it. He, Owen Rees, the cartographer, would draw the map of Langereg's shifting heart. He cleared his desk, pushing aside his old, inadequate maps. He found fresh rolls of large-format tracing paper, his finest pens, his most precise rulers and compasses. But he knew these tools alone would not be enough. He needed to see, to perceive, all the layers at once. He began to draw, not copying the small diagram from the journal, but using it as a key, a conceptual starting point. He started with the modern GIS plot of Langereg, its familiar lines precise and clear. Then, on a fresh sheet of tracing paper, he overlaid the 1888 Ordnance Survey map, aligning it as best he could, the ghost of Groon Lane a faint, insistent presence. He added another layer, a parish map from 1750, its phantom districts, Weaver's Croft, Old Saltgate Ward, sprawling across areas now occupied by Victorian terraces or modern estates. Another layer, a crude sketch from a sailor's 17th-century rudder, showing a coastline that was subtly, yet significantly, different. Sheet by sheet, layer by layer, he built his composite map. The lines of different eras intersected, diverged, and sometimes, horrifyingly, merged. Streets from one century bled into fields from another. Buildings appeared and disappeared across the transparent layers, their spectral outlines flickering like ghosts. It was a cartography of chaos, a visual representation of Langereg's fluid, contradictory memory. And as he drew, as he meticulously traced these overlapping, interpenetrating realities, something extraordinary, something terrifying, began to happen. His surroundings, the familiar confines of his study, began to change. He was tracing the outline of the long-vanished St. Brannach's close from the 1750 map, its boundaries overlying the modern-day car park behind the library. As his pen moved, the solid wall of his study, the one with the bookshelf filled with cartographic theory, flickered. For a moment, he saw not books, but rough-hewn stone, a narrow, arched window admitting a sliver of gray light that smelled of wood smoke and damp wool. He blinked, and his bookshelf was back, but the faint scent of wood smoke lingered. He continued drawing, his focus absolute, a strange, almost feverish energy coursing through him. He mapped the shifting course of the river Lurie as depicted on various maps, its meanders sometimes cutting through areas where his own cottage now stood. As he did so, he heard the faint, unmistakable sound of running water, seemingly coming from beneath his floorboards. The air in the study grew colder, damper. The more he drew, the more he layered the forgotten geographies of Langereg onto his composite map, the more his immediate reality became unstable, porous. The walls of his study seemed to throb with a faint, internal light. Shadows stretched and contracted at impossible angles. The window, which had earlier shown him the phantom copse of trees, now looked out onto a bustling, muddy marketplace that could have been lifted from the 18th century, complete with the cries of vendors and the smell of livestock, before dissolving back into the familiar, unsettling stillness of his neglected back garden. He was not merely mapping Langereg's past. He was, somehow, drawing it into his present. Or perhaps, drawing himself into its manifold presence. Chapter 10, The Observer Effect. The composite map grew, a monstrous, multi-layered palimpsest of Langereg's spatial history. Owen worked tirelessly, days and nights blurring into a continuous, obsessive effort. He didn't eat, he barely slept. His only sustenance was the terrifying, exhilarating act of creation, of giving form to the unseen cartography. He realized with a chilling clarity that the town, this entity that was Langereg, was not governed by the laws of physics as he understood them. Its geography was not fixed, not absolute. It was shaped, at least in part, by observation, by memory, by the very act of attempting to map it. The 1841 planner had written, "The map forgets because the land remembers." But Owen now understood a deeper, more terrifying truth: the land also responds. It responds to being remembered, to being observed, to being mapped. His own obsessive focus, his meticulous documentation of the anomalies, his very act of trying to understand Groom Lane, had not been a passive investigation. It had been an interaction, a dialogue. He had focused his consciousness on the hidden geometries of Langereg, and in doing so, he had amplified their influence, given them purchase on his perception, and ultimately on his reality. He was not just discovering the unseen cartography, he was, in a way, co-creating it, or at least, strengthening its presence in his own subjective experience. The more he mapped its fluid, non-Euclidean nature, the more his own surroundings conformed to that mutability. The changes in his cottage were no longer fleeting flickers. They were becoming more persistent, more tangible. The phantom staircase he had seen in the smashed bathroom mirror now existed, a dark, spiraling presence leading up from his landing into an attic space that had never been there before, an attic that echoed with faint, sorrowful whispers. The black door in the hallway sometimes stood ajar, revealing not just the warped kitchen, but glimpses of other, stranger rooms beyond, a dusty, book-lined study that was not his own, a child's nursery, eerily silent, a long, stone corridor that seemed to stretch into infinity. His reflection, when he dared to catch a glimpse of it in a darkened windowpane, was no longer entirely his own. His features seemed subtly altered, his eyes holding a depth of ancient, weary knowledge that was not Owen Reese's. He was becoming integrated, absorbed. He was a cartographer caught in a terrifying feedback loop. The more he mapped the shifting reality, the more his reality shifted. The more he tried to pin down the elusive, multi-layered nature of Langereg, the more he himself became a part of that elusive, multi-layered fabric. He began to incorporate the 1841 planner's metamap more directly into his own composite creation, its non-Euclidean lines and interpenetrating shapes forming a kind of skeletal framework around which the various historical layouts of Langereg coalesced and dissolved. As he drew these impossible geometries, he felt his own mind stretching, contorting, accommodating concepts of space and dimension that would have once shattered his sanity. Now, they felt intuitive. He was no longer just mapping Langereg. He was mapping himself into Langereg. The final realization came to him not as a sudden epiphany, but as a slow, cold dawning, like a Langereg sunrise filtered through perpetual fog. He was standing before his vast, composite map, which now covered an entire wall of his study, a chaotic, beautiful, terrifying testament to the town's fluid soul. His hand, holding a pen, was still moving, adding another layer, another forgotten lane, another spectral building. He looked at his hand, at the lines it was tracing. And he understood. He was the new core. The heart. Or at least, a new node in the town's conscious, spatial network. His obsession, his cartographer's mind, his ability to perceive the subtle shifts and hidden layers, had made him a perfect conduit, a perfect anchor for Langereg's protean nature. The 1841 planner had been lost, his ink run dry, his ability to witness and record perhaps failing. Owen was his replacement. The town was alive, not in a biological sense, but as a conscious, spatial entity, its geography a reflection of its memories, its perceptions, its needs. And it needed to be mapped, to be witnessed, to have its shifting, paradoxical nature affirmed by a conscious mind. Without a cartographer, without an observer attuned to its true nature, perhaps it would unravel, its many layers collapsing into incoherence. Or perhaps it would simply withdraw, its secrets receding entirely from human perception, leaving behind only the bland, unchanging facade of a normal seaside town. Owen Rees, the meticulous archivist, had sought to understand the logic of space. He had found, instead, a space whose logic was that of dream, of memory, of consciousness itself. And in his relentless pursuit, he had become inextricably bound to it. He was no longer just mapping Langereg. Langereg was mapping him. The lines on his composite chart were the lines of his own psyche, his own disintegrating, reforming self. He was a living component of the unseen cartography, his perception the lens through which the town's manifold realities bled through into the mundane world. He looked around his study. The walls were a shimmering tapestry of overlapping eras. Through one, he saw the dark, writhing roots of Groom Lane. Through another, the bustling 18th-century marketplace. The ceiling above him was a star chart of impossible constellations. His reality was no longer his own. It was a composite, just like his map. He was trapped. Not in a physical sense, but within the very fabric of Langereg's being, a sentient point on an ever-shifting, infinite map. His work was not done. It would never be done. As long as Langereg remembered, as long as it breathed and folded and reformed itself, it would need its cartographer. He picked up his pen. There was a new layer to add, a faint, shimmering outline of a street that had only just begun to bleed through from some forgotten future, or perhaps, some alternate present. The work continued. The map behind the map was endless. And Owen Rees, its chosen draftsman, was now, and forever, a part of its terrible, unseen design. Chapter 11, The Endless Revision. The pen in Owen's hand moved with a life of its own, yet it was his life, his will, intertwined with the deeper, ancient will of Langereg. He no longer questioned the source of the faint, shimmering outline his nib traced, a street that twisted with the impossible curvature of a Klein bottle, its cobbles seeming to reflect stars that had died millennia ago. It was simply the next line, the next layer in the perpetual revision that was both Langereg and himself. His study was no longer a room in a cottage, it was a nexus, a point of confluence where all the Langeregs, past, present, potential, and perhaps even those that never were, bled into one another. The air itself was thick with the scent of centuries, brine and wood smoke, damp earth and ozone, the metallic tang of old blood and the sterile scent of digital archives yet to be built. Whispers filled the space, not just the sorrowful murmurs from the phantom attic, but the cries of market vendors from a forgotten era, the chanting of monks from a chapel whose stones had long since crumbled into the sea, the hiss of static from futures he could not yet comprehend. He was the curator of this temporal and spatial cacophony, his task to find the fragile coherence within it, to trace the lines of connection, however tenuous, however terrifying. The composite map on his wall was less a static representation and more a living organism, its layers shifting, its lines subtly reconfiguring themselves even as he worked. Sometimes, an entire district he had painstakingly rendered would fade, its ink paling as if Langereg had decided to forget it, only for a new, equally baffling configuration to assert itself elsewhere on the vellum. He had become accustomed to the shifting vistas beyond his window. One moment, the dark, primeval copse, the next, the bustling 18th-century market, then, perhaps, a glimpse of a Langereg built of chrome and glass, towering into a sky of bruised purple clouds. These were not hallucinations, they were facets, truths of the town's multifaceted being, accessible now through the lens of his altered perception. The black door in his hallway remained. Sometimes, he would find it ajar, and from beyond it would drift the scent of his mother's Welsh cakes, a sound like his father's laughter, memories from his own past, now woven into the town's broader recollections. Langereg consumed not just space and time, but personal history, integrating it into its vast, incomprehensible archive. He learned not to venture through that door seeking solace, the reflections it offered were always flawed, always tinged with the cold, earthy scent of the lane, reminders that even his most cherished memories were now part of the town's mutable data. He no longer felt hunger, or thirst, or the need for sleep in the human sense. His sustenance came from the act of mapping, from the flow of spatial information that coursed through him. He was a nerve ending for the town, a sensory organ. When a new anomaly tried to assert itself within Langereg's fabric, a house attempting to unexist, a new, impossible alleyway trying to carve itself into reality, he would feel it as a dissonant chord, a painful pressure in his own mind. His task was then to integrate it into the metamap, to find its place within the unseen cartography, or to gently guide it back into the dormant potential from which it had sprung. He was a regulator, a gatekeeper, as much as a chronicler. Did others in Langereg perceive these subtle shifts? He suspected some did, in fleeting, unsettling moments. A sudden, inexplicable sense of déjà vu in an unfamiliar street. A momentary disorientation, a feeling that a familiar landmark was not quite where it should be. The lingering local tales of houses that sighed, of paths that led nowhere, of places that were not right. These were the faint ripples, the echoes of the deeper currents that he now navigated. Most would dismiss them, their minds quick to reassert a stable, consensual reality. But for a few, perhaps, the ripples might become waves, drawing them closer to the town's unsettling truth. And Langereg, he knew, was always hungry for new perspectives, new witnesses. He sometimes wondered about Nia Evans, about the brief flicker of terrified understanding he had seen in her eyes. Would she, too, eventually be drawn back, her historian's curiosity overriding her fear? Or had her glimpse been enough to inoculate her, to allow her to retreat to a world of more stable narratives? He felt a pang of something akin to regret, a ghost of human connection. But it was quickly subsumed by the vaster, colder imperatives of the lane, of the land. His existence was one of perpetual vigilance, perpetual revision. He was the guardian of Langereg's impossible boundaries, the interpreter of its fluid, paradoxical nature. He was no longer Owen Rees, the meticulous cartographer who sought order. He was an embodiment of Langereg's chaos, finding a strange, terrifying, and endless purpose within it. The fog still rolled in from the sea, as it always had, shrouding Langereg in its grey embrace. But for Owen, the fog was no longer an obscuring blanket. It was a veil between the layers, a medium through which the different realities of the town whispered to each other. And he, the cartographer of chaos, stood at the heart of it, his pen moving ceaselessly across the endless, shifting vellum, tracing the lines of a map that could never be finished, a map that was Langereg itself, forever remembering, forever forgetting, forever bleeding through. His work was the town's breath, its heartbeat. And as long as the land remembered, Owen Rees, or what had once been Owen Rees, would be there to draw its unseen, unending, and utterly terrifying design. The map behind the map was his life, his eternity, his silent, solitary, and sacred task. And in the quiet, impossible rooms of his transformed cottage, surrounded by the whispers of 1,000 Langeregs, he was, in his own way, finally home. Chapter 12, The Echo in the Ink. Years, or perhaps moments, time, like space, had become a fluid concept for Owen, passed in the rhythm of his endless cartography. The composite map on his study wall was now a vast, palimpsestic tapestry, so dense with overlapping lines, faded erasures, and newly asserted phantom geographies that it seemed to breathe with its own internal light. It had expanded beyond the confines of the wall, creeping onto the floor, across the ceiling, the lines of ink like dark veins in a living organism. His study was less a room and more the hollow heart of this ever-expanding chart. He had learned the language of Langereg's spatial shifts, the subtle premonitions that heralded a new bleed-through or the fading of an old memory. A particular scent of brine and petrichor might signal the re-emergence of a long-lost smuggler's cove near the harbor, its ghostly outline briefly superimposing itself over the modern esplanade. A sudden, inexplicable chill in the air, accompanied by the faint sound of children's laughter, could mean that St. Brannock's Close, with its phantom inhabitants, was attempting to solidify its presence for a few hours. His role had evolved. He was not merely a passive recorder. He had learned, through a terrifying intimacy with the town's non-Euclidean framework, to exert a subtle influence. When a particularly jarring or disruptive anomaly threatened to tear too violently at the consensual reality experienced by Langereg's more mundane inhabitants, Owen could, with immense concentration, gently guide it back, smoothing the edges of the spatial tear, encouraging that particular memory of the land to reseed into the deeper layers of the metamap. He was a weaver, constantly mending the fragile tapestry, ensuring that the bleed-throughs did not become gaping wounds. This power came at a cost. Each act of intervention, each conscious manipulation of Langereg's spatial energies, drew him deeper into its being, further eroding the last vestiges of the man named Owen Rees. His physical form, rarely glimpsed even by himself, had become translucent, his outlines indistinct, as if he too were a drawing on tracing paper, slowly merging with the greater composition. His thoughts were less his own and more a reflection of the town's manifold consciousness, a chorus of historical anxieties, forgotten joys, and ancient, geological imperatives. Sometimes, new witnesses would appear. He would sense their approach, a flicker of heightened curiosity, a mind beginning to perceive the cracks in the mundane. He felt a distant, cold pity for them. He knew the path they were treading. He would not intervene to save them, that was not his role. The town needed its observers, its anchors. He would simply note their arrival on his ever-changing map, another small, bright point of consciousness briefly illuminating a forgotten corner before, inevitably, being absorbed. He became aware of other keepers, like himself, in other Langereggs scattered across the globe, other nexus points where the unseen cartography asserted itself. They were not connected by roads or cables, but by the deep, resonant lines of the metamap, by shared, impossible geometries. He could feel their distant presence, a network of solitary consciousnesses, each tending to their own fluid, demanding territory. There was a bleak comfort in this knowledge, the understanding that he was not unique in his terrible, sacred duty. The 1841 planner's journal was now almost a part of him, its faded ink a whisper in his own expanded mind. He understood the planner's final, desperate word, lost. Lost to the mundane world, yes. But found, in a terrifying and profound way, by the land, by the map that remembers. One day, if such a term still had meaning, a new anomaly presented itself, one that resonated with a peculiar, personal frequency. He felt a disturbance not in the broader geography of Langeregg, but within the very fabric of his own composite map. A new line was trying to assert itself, a faint, hesitant trace. He focused his perception, his consciousness flowing along the interpenetrating layers of his creation. The line was thin, almost apologetic, rendered in an ink that was not his own, yet familiar. It depicted a small, unassuming lane, tucked between Shipwright's Row and the old custom house path. Groon Lane. But this was not the Groon Lane of the 1888 Ordnance Survey, nor the terrifying, organic gullet he had once entered. This was something new, a subtle echo, a reinterpretation. It was as if the town, or perhaps his own fractured consciousness, was trying to reconcile the original anomaly, the one that had started his journey, with the vast, complex understanding he now possessed. He watched, with a detachment that would have once horrified him, as this new, ghostly Groon Lane sketched itself onto the palimpsest. It did not erase what was already there, it simply added another layer, another possibility, another memory. And then, a new sensation. A faint, almost imperceptible pinprick of external observation. Someone, somewhere in the mundane layer of Langeregg, was noticing. Perhaps a young, meticulous archivist, poring over old maps, had stumbled upon a discrepancy, a line that shouldn't be there, a name that didn't fit. Perhaps they were feeling that first, faint prickle of unease, that initial, easily dismissible sense that the logic of space was not quite as solid as they believed. Owen felt a cold, ancient smile that was not entirely his own touch his ethereal features. The cycle was beginning anew. The map was always being revised. The land was always remembering. And Langeregg, in its infinite, hungry patience, was always waiting for its next cartographer. His own pen continued to move, tracing the endless, shifting lines, integrating this new echo of Groon Lane into the vast, terrible, and beautiful map behind the map. His work was never done. He was a line in the ink, an echo in the archive, a part of the unseen cartography, forever. And the town, in its myriad forms, breathed around him, a silent, eternal testament to the spaces that lie just beyond the edge of perception, waiting to be charted. Chapter 13, The Signature in the Margin. The emergence of the new, spectral Groon Lane on his composite map, and the faint, distant tremor of a new observer noticing its incongruity in the mundane world, brought a subtle shift in Owen's timeless existence. It was not a change in his task, which remained as constant and demanding as Langeregg's own fluid nature. Rather, it was a deepening of his understanding of the process, of the cyclical, almost regenerative way the unseen cartography maintained itself. He was not the first keeper of Langereg, nor, he now fully comprehended, would he be the last. The 1841 planner, whose desperate journal had been his guide, had been one in a long lineage. Each keeper, in their time, mapped the town according to their own perceptions, their own obsessions, their own unique way of seeing the stitches in the skin of the world. Each contributed their own layer to the metamap, their own unique signature to the town's vast, collective memory. His own contribution, he realized, was characterized by a meticulous, almost obsessive attention to the interplay of historical layers, the way past and present bled into each other. He saw his composite map not just as a record, but as a dialogue between eras, a constant negotiation of Langereg's many selves. The black door in his hallway, the warped kitchen, the phantom staircases, these were the physical manifestations of that dialogue, the points where his own mind, his own cottage, had become a nexus for the town's temporal bleeding. The new observer, this distant, unseen mind now puzzling over a line on an old map, would eventually, if their curiosity and resilience held, begin their own journey. They would encounter their own unique anomalies, their own personal Grun lanes. Their path into the unseen cartography would be shaped by their own profession, their own fears, their own way of trying to impose order on the encroaching chaos. And if they reached the heart of it, if Langereg chose them, they too would become a keeper, adding their own distinct layer to the ever-evolving map. Owen felt no jealousy, no sense of being replaced. Such human emotions were like faded ink on an old chart, barely legible. He was an integral part of Langereg now, as much a feature of its impossible landscape as the shifting coastline or the phantom weaver's croft. His existence was defined by his function, and that function was perpetual. He began to perceive, within the deepest strata of the metamap, the faint traces of keepers even older than the 1841 planner. Whispers in forgotten dialects, symbols that hinted at pre-Roman understandings of the land's energies, geometries that spoke of a time when the veil between worlds was perhaps even thinner, more permeable. Langereg had been a thin place for millennia, its true nature perceived and recorded in ways that changed with human consciousness, yet always pointed towards the same underlying, mutable reality. His work took on a new dimension. He was not just mapping the Langereg of human history, but the deeper, geological Langereg, the memory of the stones themselves, the ebb and flow of ancient seas, the slow grind of tectonic plates that had first created this unique spatial weakness, this fold in the fabric of the world. These were lines of immense slowness, of almost imperceptible change, yet they formed the bedrock upon which all the fleeting human cartographies were drawn. The study around him, if it could still be called that, was now almost entirely subsumed by the map. He existed within its layers, his own consciousness a point of light moving through its intricate, glowing pathways. The physical tools, the pens, the tracing paper, had long since become extensions of his will, their ink flowing with the very essence of his perception. Occasionally, he would sense an attempt by the mundane world to correct the anomalies he tended. A new survey might try to definitively fix a boundary that Langereg preferred to keep fluid. A historical society might attempt to debunk a local legend that was, in fact, a coded reference to a recurring spatial bleed. Owen would then subtly intervene, not by overt action, but by influencing the cartographic record itself, a misplaced decimal point in a digital database, a lost page from an old deed, a subtle blurring of a crucial line on a scanned map. He was the unseen editor, the guardian of Langereg's ambiguities, ensuring that the town's true nature could never be entirely pinned down, never fully exorcised by the rigid logic of a single, stable reality. He understood now that the entity, or force, was Langereg itself, a sentient geography, a genius loci of immense power and antiquity. It was not malevolent, not in any human sense. It simply was, and its nature was to shift, to remember, to bleed through, to test and ultimately to incorporate those minds that could perceive its depths. It was a process of reality maintenance, albeit a reality far stranger and more complex than most could imagine. And Owen Rees, the cartographer who had sought the logic of space, had become the signature in its margin, a name whispered in the rustle of old maps, a line of ink in the endless, shifting chronicle of the unseen cartography. His map was Langereg, and Langereg was him, an eternal, symbiotic revision, a testament to the terrifying beauty of a world where the lines are never truly fixed, and the truest maps are those drawn on the fabric of consciousness itself. The work went on, silent, ceaseless, and utterly consuming. And in the heart of the ever-changing town, the cartographer remembered, and was remembered in turn. Chapter 14, The Cartographer's Legacy. The cycle turned. Owen felt the new observer's presence grow stronger, their tentative explorations of Langereg's anomalies becoming more focused, more obsessive. He could sense their fear, their confusion, their dawning, horrified understanding, emotions he himself had traversed in what felt like a lifetime ago, or perhaps only yesterday. He felt a strange, dispassionate empathy, the way one might observe an ant navigating a complex, shifting labyrinth of one's own design. This new mind, he perceived, was different from his own, different from the 1841 planner. Their approach was less about historical layers and precise measurements, and more about the narrative of place, the stories the town told about itself. They were drawn to folklore, to oral histories, to the psychological impact of Langereg's unsettling atmosphere on its inhabitants. Their emerging map would be one of whispers and shadows, of collective anxieties and half-forgotten traumas. Owen did not interfere with their journey. He merely observed, his consciousness a silent witness within the metamap. He saw how Langereg subtly adapted to this new observer, its manifestations shifting to resonate with their particular mode of perception. The anomalies they encountered were less about overtly shifting buildings or impossible geometries, and more about uncanny coincidences, unsettling dreams shared by unrelated townsfolk, a pervasive sense of being watched, of unspoken histories seeping into the present. The unseen cartography was, he understood, infinitely adaptable. It was not a fixed set of rules or phenomena, but a dynamic interface between a deeper, alien reality and the perceiving human consciousness. It manifested in ways that would most effectively ensnare, challenge, and ultimately integrate the mind that dared to look too closely. One day, Owen felt a new layer begin to form on his own vast, internal composite map. It was not a layer he was consciously drawing, but one that was emerging organically, as if Langereg itself were adding a new chapter. This layer was fainter, more ephemeral than his own meticulously traced lines. It was composed of fragmented sentences, snatches of overheard conversations, dream images, symbols that were more emotional than geometric. It was the nascent map of the new observer, their unique perception of Langereg beginning to imprint itself upon the town's eternal record. He realized then that his own work, his own layer, was becoming part of the historical strata for this new keeper in the making. His meticulous charts of shifting streets and phantom districts, the very anomalies that had consumed him, would become historical data for them, part of the lore of Langereg's strangeness. His own transformation, his absorption into the unseen cartography, would become another story, another warning, another enigmatic clue. He was becoming part of the town's memory, just as the 1841 planner had become part of his. The keepers did not replace each other, they accreted, each adding their unique understanding, their unique mode of mapping, to the ever-growing, infinitely complex whole. Langereg did not discard its old cartographers, it integrated them, making their consciousness part of its own. He felt a sense of completion. Not an end to his task, for that was eternal, but a fulfillment of a cycle. He had mapped his Langereg, the Langereg of historical bleed-through and non-Euclidean geometry. He had become its guardian, its interpreter. Now, a new interpretation was beginning, a new layer was being added. His own lines on the metamap, once so vibrant and dominant in his perception, began to settle, to integrate more deeply into the older strata. They did not fade, but they became less a focus of active creation and more a part of the established, foundational truth of the place. His consciousness, while still bound to Langereg, felt a subtle diffusion, emerging with the vaster, collective memory of the town. The intense, focused energy of his active mapping period lessened, replaced by a more profound, contemplative awareness. He was less the frantic draftsman, more the ancient archive itself, holding within his being all the accumulated maps, all the forgotten stories, all the shifting realities of Langereg. He could still feel the new observer, their struggle, their dawning terror and fascination. He was a silent, unseen guide in the labyrinth they now navigated, his own mapped pathways serving as potential routes, or warnings, for their journey. His legacy was not in a finished map, for such a thing was impossible. His legacy was in the continuation of the process, in the endless, terrifying, and beautiful act of trying to chart the unchartable. The fog rolled in, thick and gray, and Langereg settled into its timeless rhythm of remembering and forgetting. Deep within its hidden heart, within the layers of the unseen cartography, Owen Rees, the cartographer who had looked too closely, became another signature in the margin, another echo in the ink, another eternal line on the map behind the map. And the new observer, driven by their own unique form of meticulous obsession, took their first, hesitant steps onto the path that he had, in his own time, so irrevocably trod. The work, in all its myriad forms, continued. The Whispering Atlas. Chapter 1, Groom Lane. I always believed maps lied only in small ways, in approximations, in forgotten alleys, in human error. Lies you could forgive. The idea that a map could lie on purpose, or worse, out of ignorance, seemed like paranoia to me. Back then. Each morning, I arrived at the municipal archive office in Langereg, unlocked the side door, made myself tea in the staff kitchen, and sat down at my terminal. My name is Alastair Finch, and my job was quiet, meticulous, scanning, digitizing, and updating old regional maps for the planning office. Decades worth of documents passed through my hands, brittle parchment with ink faded to ghostly gray, annotations in Victorian cursive, entire neighborhoods that no longer existed. There was something soothing about it, the geometry, the logic, the containment of chaos within borders and lines. I liked that the world, on paper, made sense. That day, a Tuesday muffled by the perennial Langereg drizzle, I was working with an 1884 surveyor's map, hand-drawn, but surprisingly accurate. Whoever made it had a sharp eye, a steady hand. I overlaid it with a current GIS layer out of habit, lining up the River Lurry and key intersections like St. Cadoc's Spire and the Old Market Cross. Precision was my trade, my comfort. That's when I noticed it. A thin, barely noticeable passage between Old Court, a cramped warren of ancient stone buildings, and St. Mary's Row, a terrace of slightly newer, though still venerable, townhouses, labeled in elegant, spidery script, Groom Lane. A narrow alley, maybe 30 meters long, joining two enclosed courtyards. On the 1884 map, it was clearly marked, name, dimensions meticulously noted in faint pencil, even tiny directional arrows indicating a slight incline. But in every modern layer, municipal plans, digital overlays, even the ubiquitous eye of Google Earth, the space was blank. An overgrown, inaccessible yard, if anything, wedged between the unyielding backs of buildings. I frowned, zoomed in on my monitor, the pixels blurring slightly. I cross-checked a few property records for Old Court and St. Mary's Row. Nothing. No official mention of Groom Lane in the town database. No mention in historical registries of street names, no utility records indicating buried pipes or cables, no record of its closure or renaming. Just, absence. As though it had never been there, despite the confident ink of the 1884 surveyor. A printing error? A proposed path that never came to fruition, mistakenly included as extant? Possibly. Langereg's older maps were notorious for their eccentricities. Cartographic optimism, my predecessor used to call it. I made a note of it in my digital logbook, under discrepancies, minor. It didn't feel urgent, just curious, a small knot in the otherwise smooth weave of the town's documented history. That evening, I took my usual walk. Routine keeps the mind sharp, I've always believed. Every evening, same loop, down Queen Street toward the river, its surface like hammered pewter under the gray sky, past the skeletal ruins of the old priory, then west through the labyrinthine passages of Old Court, and back around via the slightly more orderly St. Mary's Row. As I turned the corner near St. Mary's, where the back of the terrace met the ancient, windowless wall of a former workshop in Old Court, I slowed. The drizzle had thickened to a persistent mist, a classic Langeregg welcome, blurring the edges of things, muffling sound. The place where Groen Lane should have been, between two walls, one of soot-stained brick, one of newer, starker concrete blockwork, was just a patch of weedy grass, choked with nettles and discarded plastic, hemmed in on both sides by high, unyielding barriers. But there was something off. An old rusted signpost stuck up from the damp earth at a crooked angle, like a forgotten sentinel. Its metal face was blank, long since scrubbed featureless by time, weather, or perhaps deliberate vandalism. But its presence suggested something had once been named here. I stepped closer, my shoes crunching on unseen debris beneath the weeds. The air was colder here, oddly still, the mist clinging in denser pockets. The shadows didn't fall quite right from the overhanging eaves of the workshop. They seemed deeper, less defined by the weak ambient light, as if they emanated from the space itself. I tried to picture a lane running through, the 30 meters indicated on the map, but the angle of the walls seemed subtly wrong. As though they had been moved, ever so slightly, squeezed together, or perhaps the space between them had contracted. The sensation was brief but nauseating, like a sudden drop in pressure, momentary vertigo that made the ground feel unstable beneath my feet. I took out my phone and snapped a picture, more out of habit than any clear intention. It came out grainy, as expected, low light, the mist diffusing what little illumination there was. But when I looked at it later, back in the sterile brightness of my flat, I squinted. Something about the depth in the photograph was off. The walls in the image looked farther apart than they had felt in person. Or was it closer? The perspective seemed to subtly shift as I stared at it, an optical trick that made my eyes ache. Overthinking, I muttered, closing the image. Stress, probably. Too many hours staring at lines on screens. I turned away from the non-existent lane, trying to shake off the prickling unease. I walked home faster than usual, glancing back once at the dark, weed-choked shape nestled between the buildings. It felt like something had shifted. Not dramatically. Just a notch. Like a gear inside the world, a tiny, almost imperceptible cog, had clicked into a different groove. I made dinner, pasta, simple, routine, and watched television, some mindless nature documentary about the immutable laws of the wild. But I couldn't stop thinking about the lane. I even pulled the 1884 map back up on my laptop, its scanned image crisp and clear, tracing the elegant lines of Groen Lane with my fingertip on the screen. It was there, as clearly as anything. Groen Lane. In ink. With measurements. A fact, recorded by a meticulous hand. And yet, nothing. That night, I awoke around 2:13 a.m., heart thumping, certain I'd heard something. Not a creak of the old cottage, not the wind sighing in the chimney, sounds I was accustomed to. This was a faint rustling. Indefinably dry, stealthy. Like paper sliding beneath the floorboards. Old, brittle paper. I lay there, rigid, listening. The sound did not repeat. There was only the familiar silence of the Langeregg night, the distant, mournful cry of a foghorn from the estuary. My imagination, of course. The maps were getting to me. But as I drifted back into an uneasy sleep, the image of Groen Lane, clear and definite on the old surveyor's sheet, superimposed itself over the dark, weed-choked reality. And a new, unwelcome thought surfaced. What if the error wasn't on the old map, but in the world itself? What if a place could simply cease to be remembered by the land it occupied? The thought was absurd. Illogical. But it lingered, a cold spot in the quiet geometry of my mind. Chapter 2, Degrees of Absence. The rustling sound, that dry whisper of paper in the dead of night, did not return. I dismissed it as a product of an overactive imagination, fueled by too much archival dust and the unsettling discovery of Groen Lane. Yet, the unease it had sown took root. My daily routines, usually a source of quiet comfort, now felt like a fragile defense against a subtle, encroaching strangeness. At the archive, I found myself returning to the 1884 map, and then to others of a similar vintage. Groom Lane was not an isolated anomaly. As I delved deeper, I began to find other discrepancies, other faint lines on old charts depicting footpaths that no longer existed, small courtyards that had seemingly vanished, even a tiny stone footbridge over a stream that, according to modern records, had been culverted and buried a century prior, yet here it was, sketched with loving detail in 1872, complete with notes on its mossy parapet. These were, for the most part, explainable. Urban development, forgotten rights of way, the relentless march of progress. Langereg was an old town, its fabric was bound to shift and change. But the way Groom Lane was absent felt different. It wasn't built over, not obviously. It wasn't renamed. It was simply, not there. Erased, not by construction, but by a kind of spatial amnesia. The photograph I'd taken of the non-existent lane continued to bother me. I'd look at it on my phone, and each time, the perspective seemed subtly different. One moment, the gap between the walls looked narrow, almost impassable. The next, it seemed wider, deeper, the darkness within it more profound. I told myself it was an optical illusion, a trick of the poor lighting and the mist. But the inconsistency was unnerving. My evening walks became less about mental clarity and more about a low-grade, obsessive investigation. I started varying my route slightly, exploring other old ginnels and backways, comparing their current state to their depictions on the older maps I was now studying with a new, almost feverish intensity. I found other spots where the air felt colder, where shadows clung unnaturally, where the dimensions of a space felt subtly at odds with its visual appearance. A narrow passage off Chapel Street, marked as Monk's Passage on an 1850 tithe map, now ended in a solid brick wall that looked centuries old, yet the map clearly showed it connecting to the churchyard. Standing before that wall, I felt the same brief, nauseating vertigo I'd experienced at Groom Lane. I began to document these inconsistencies more formally, not just in the official office log, but in a private notebook. I noted the map references, the dates, my own sensory impressions. I even started taking measurements, surreptitiously, with a small laser measure I usually kept for verifying print dimensions. The discrepancies were always minor, often within what could be considered a margin of error for older surveying techniques. A few inches here, a foot or two there. But they were consistent. Spaces that should have been, weren't. Spaces that were, sometimes felt, wrong. One afternoon, I was working on digitizing a set of detailed architectural plans for the old custom house, a building not far from Groom Lane's supposed location. The plans were from 1902, for a minor renovation. I noticed something odd about the depiction of the building's rear elevation. It showed a small, arched doorway, bricked up, with a notation, former access to Ropemaker's Walk. Ropemaker's Walk was another phantom, a narrow alley that appeared on several late 19th century maps, running parallel to the river, but was now entirely absent, subsumed by a modern flood defense wall. Curiosity gnawed at me. After work, I went to the old custom house. The rear of the building was a grim expanse of weathered stone and brick. I ran my hands along the wall where the 1902 plans indicated the bricked-up doorway should be. And there, beneath a layer of grime and lichen, I could just make out the faint, curved outline of a filled-in arch, the bricks slightly different in color and texture from the surrounding stonework. It was a small thing, a perfectly logical piece of architectural history. A doorway closed off when a lane behind it ceased to be used. But standing there, touching those old bricks, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the damp evening air. The plans were right. Ropemaker's Walk had existed. Its ghost was still imprinted on the fabric of the town. Why, then, was Groom Lane so utterly, completely absent, leaving only a blank signpost and a patch of weeds? The following Saturday, I decided to confront the Groom Lane anomaly more directly. I took my private notebook, my laser measure, and a good quality digital camera, determined to document the site properly in daylight. The mist had cleared, and a pale, watery sun cast weak shadows. The space between the walls looked less menacing in the daylight, merely neglected. The blank signpost still stood sentinel. I started by measuring the width of the gap at various points. It was inconsistent, ranging from just under 2 meters at its narrowest to nearly 3 at its widest, where it opened slightly towards Old Court. The 1884 map had indicated a consistent width of approximate 7 feet, roughly 2.1 meters. So, parts of it were wider, parts narrower. Not entirely inconsistent, perhaps, allowing for the imprecision of approximate. But as I took photographs, meticulously framing each shot, trying to capture the true dimensions, the unsettling feeling returned. Through the camera lens, the space seemed to subtly resist accurate representation. The angles of the walls looked different from how they appeared to my naked eye. Shadows seemed to deepen or lighten inexplicably between shots, even though the sun's position hadn't changed. One photograph showed what looked like a faint, dark opening at the far end of the weedy patch, near the Old Court wall, almost like the entrance to a cellar. When I looked with my own eyes, there was nothing but a dense clump of ivy. I focused on the blank signpost. It was old, the metal pitted with rust, the post itself set deep in the earth. I wondered what name it had once displayed. Groon Lane. Or something else entirely. As I photographed it, I noticed something I'd missed in the gloom of my previous visit. Scratched faintly into the rusted metal, almost invisible, were a few spidery marks. Not letters, not a name. More like symbols. 3 jagged lines, like a stylized M or a depiction of mountain peaks, and beneath them, a small, off-kilter spiral. A shiver traced its way down my spine. These weren't random scratches. They looked deliberate, like some archaic sigil or a forgotten piece of graffiti. I photographed them close up, my hand unsteady. As I was packing up my camera, an old woman emerged from a nearby doorway in St. Mary's Row, a small, terrier-like dog on a lead. She paused, watching me with undisguised curiosity. "Lost something, have you, love?" she asked, her voice surprisingly strong, her eyes sharp and intelligent beneath a shock of white hair. I felt a flush of embarrassment, caught snooping. "Oh, no. Just interested in local history. This old lane." I gestured vaguely at the weedy patch. The old woman's expression changed. A flicker of something, caution, crossed her face. "Lane?" she said, her voice flat. "There's no lane there, dear. Hasn't been for as long as I can remember. And I've lived on this row 72 years. But old maps show one," I persisted, perhaps unwisely. "Called Groon Lane." She tooted, pulling her dog closer. "Maps," she said, with a dismissive sniff. "Maps say all sorts of things. Doesn't make them true. That bit there," she nodded towards the weeds, "best left alone. Always been a bit damp. Unsettled. Unsettled." The word resonated with the strange vertigo, the shifting perspectives. "Did you ever hear anyone call it Groon Lane?" I asked. She looked at me then, a long, appraising stare. "Some old folk, when I was a girl, they had names for places that weren't on any signpost. Funny names. Unlucky names. Best not to go stirring things up, eh?" She gave a curt nod, and then, with a sharp tug on her dog's lead, she turned and walked briskly away, leaving me alone with the blank signpost and its cryptic scratches. Her words, her warning, did nothing to dampen my curiosity. Instead, they fanned it into a small, insistent flame. Unlucky names. Best left alone. What secrets did this non-existent lane hold? That night, the rustling sound returned. Louder this time. More insistent. Not just paper sliding, but a dry, papery breathing, seeming to emanate from the very walls of my cottage. And with it, a faint, almost imperceptible smell, the scent of old ink, decaying parchment, and something else, something like damp earth, freshly turned. I sat bolt upright in bed, my heart hammering. The smell was undeniable. It was the smell of the archive, the smell of old maps, but it was here, in my bedroom, in the dead of night. The world, I was beginning to fear, was not making as much sense as I had always believed. And its lines, its borders, were starting to feel terrifyingly permeable. Chapter 3, The Unfolding Anomaly. The smell of old ink and damp earth lingered in my bedroom until the gray light of dawn, a ghostly miasma that defied rational explanation. I rose, unrest, a knot of anxiety tightening in my chest. The rustling, the scent, it was too specific, too tied to my work, to the maps, to be easily dismissed as a generic haunting or a trick of a tired mind. It felt targeted. At the archive, the familiar scent of old paper, usually a comfort, now carried a faint undercurrent of menace. I found myself glancing nervously at the towering shelves of rolled maps, at the locked cabinets containing the most fragile and ancient documents. Were they just inanimate objects? Records of a world that was? Or were they something more, something capable of reaching out? I tried to focus on my assigned tasks, digitizing a series of mid-20th century zoning plans, a world of concrete boundaries and clear-cut regulations. But my mind kept drifting back to Groon Lane, to the blank signpost with its cryptic scratches, to the old woman's warning. During my lunch break, I pulled up the close-up photograph of the symbols on the signpost. The three jagged lines, the off-kilter spiral. They nagged at me. I'd seen something similar before, but where? I began to search through Langereg's digital historical photo archive, typing in keywords, old signs, street markings, graffiti. Nothing matched. Then, on a whim, I broadened my search to include archaeological finds from the region. And there it was. A photograph of a Bronze Age burial cyst, unearthed on the moors above Langereg in the 1930s. Carved into one of the capstones were several crude symbols. Among them, unmistakably, were the three jagged lines and a spiral, almost identical to those on the signpost. The caption described them as ritualistic markings, of unknown significance, possibly related to boundaries or pathways between worlds. Pathways between worlds. A cold dread trickled down my spine. This wasn't just an old signpost, it was marked with symbols thousands of years old, symbols linked to something else. Groon Lane wasn't just a forgotten alley, it was ancient, its roots reaching far deeper into the history of this place than any 19th century surveyor could have imagined. The anomalies began to escalate, bleeding from the specific locus of Groon Lane into my wider perception. One afternoon, I was cross-referencing a detailed 1890s street directory with a contemporary digital map. A small bakery, Powell's Pies, listed in the directory on Harbor Street, a place I'd walked past hundreds of times, simply wasn't there on the modern map. Nor was it there in reality. I knew that block of Harbor Street well, it housed a bookmaker and a charity shop. Yet, for a fleeting, disorienting moment, as I stared at the old directory entry, I could almost smell baking bread, hear the distant clatter of a shop bell. I blinked, and the sensation was gone, leaving me shaken. Another day, I was retrieving a large, rolled map of coastal erosion patterns from a high shelf. I knew exactly where it was stored, top shelf, third bay from the left. I reached up, my fingers expecting to brush against the familiar cardboard tube. Instead, they met empty air. I frowned, got the step ladder. The shelf was bare. I checked the catalog. The map was listed as being in that exact location. I searched the adjacent bays. Nothing. It was as if the map itself had simply vanished. Later that afternoon, Dillies, the office administrator, found it inexplicably misshelved in a drawer containing 17th century land deeds. She tooted about things walking, but I saw the unease in her eyes. My sense of spatial awareness, usually so acute, began to falter. Familiar routes felt subtly longer, or shorter. One evening, walking home, I turned a corner onto Market Street and for a heart-stopping moment, the street stretched out before me, unfamiliar and distorted, the buildings taller, the perspective skewed, as if I'd stepped into a badly drawn architectural rendering. I stumbled, closed my eyes, and when I opened them, Market Street was blessedly, reassuringly normal again. But the memory of that momentary distortion lingered, a terrifying glimpse of a reality that was not conforming to its own established rules. The private notebook where I documented these occurrences became my lifeline, a desperate attempt to impose some kind of order on the unraveling. November 10th, possible olfactory hallucination, smell of baking bread when viewing 1890s directory entry for Powell's pies, non-extant. Duration, approximate 5 seconds. Accompanied by auditory sensation, shop bell. November 12th, coastal erosion map, ref, CE/1922/B, missing from designated shelf. Later found in 17C deeds drawer. No logical explanation. Dilly's also perplexed. November 14th, severe spatial distortion experienced on Market Street. Approximate 1730. Street appeared elongated, perspective skewed. Duration, approximate 3 to 4 seconds. Intense vertigo. Am I losing my mind? Sleep became a landscape of shifting geometries, of streets that folded in on themselves, of maps whose lines writhed and reformed like living things. I would wake in a cold sweat, the dry, papery rustling seeming to echo in the silence of my room, the scent of old ink and damp earth clinging to my senses. I considered seeing a doctor. But what would I say? That I thought the town was subtly rewriting itself. That maps were coming to life. They'd diagnose stress, prescribe medication, suggest I take time off. The thought of my experiences being medicalized, dismissed as a purely internal malfunction, was unbearable. This felt real. Too real. My focus at work narrowed, sharpened by a kind of fearful obsession, onto Langereg's oldest, most obscure cartographic records. I unearthed a hand-drawn map from circa 1650, Mappa Mundi of Langereg town and its surroundings, its parchment cracked and discolored, its ink faded to a ghostly brown. Groon Lane was not marked. But in the approximate area, between what would become Old Court and St. Mary's Row, was a strange, amorphous blotch, colored with a faded green pigment, labeled in spidery Latin, locus umbrarum, the place of shadows. The place of shadows. The Green Lane. Groon. The connections clicked into place with a sickening lurch. This wasn't just about a forgotten alley. This was about a place, a specific locus, that had been recognized as different, as other, for centuries. That evening, driven by a compulsion I no longer tried to resist, I returned to the site of Groon Lane. The mist was thick again, swallowing the weak glow of the streetlights. The blank signpost loomed out of the gloom. I had brought a powerful torch. I shone the beam into the weed-choked space. The light seemed to be absorbed, to lose its intensity, just a few feet in. The shadows within were dense, impenetrable. I pushed aside some of the rank nettles, my heart hammering. The ground beneath was uneven, a mixture of impacted earth, broken bricks, and something softer, almost peaty. And then I saw it. Partially hidden beneath a tangle of ivy clinging to the concrete block wall, was a dark, narrow opening, no more than 2 feet high. It looked like the entrance to an old coal chute, or perhaps a long-disused drain. It hadn't been visible in the daylight photographs. Or had it? Had the space itself subtly reconfigured? The air emanating from the opening was colder than the surrounding mist, carrying that same faint, disturbing scent of old ink, damp earth, and something else, a faint, metallic tang, like rust, or old blood. My hand trembled as I directed the torch beam into the opening. It was a narrow, dark passage, sloping downwards, its sides rough-hewn, disappearing into blackness. It was too small for a person to easily enter. But it was undeniably there. A passage. Where no passage should be. Suddenly, from within the opening, from the depths of that impossible darkness, I heard a sound. Not a rustling this time. Not a whisper. A faint, dry cough. And then, a soft, drawn-out sigh, like someone stirring in their sleep. I stumbled back, a cry catching in my throat, my torch clattering to the ground. The beam spun wildly, illuminating the mist-shrouded weeds, the blank signpost, before extinguishing itself against the damp earth. I didn't wait to retrieve it. I fled, blindly, my footsteps echoing in the deserted streets, the sound of that sigh, that impossible presence, burning itself into my mind. Groon Lane was not empty. The place of shadows was inhabited. And whatever resided there was, perhaps, beginning to wake. Chapter 4, Cartographies of Fear. Sleep became a foreign country, its borders guarded by the memory of that dry cough, that sigh from the impossible opening. When exhaustion finally claimed me, my dreams were a chaotic atlas of Langereg's hidden spaces, of narrow, lightless passages twisting beneath the familiar streets, of maps whose ink bled and reformed into arcane symbols. I would wake with the scent of old paper and damp earth clinging to my nostrils, a phantom presence in my room. The archive, once my sanctuary of order, now felt like the heart of the infection. Every map I unrolled, every plan I digitized, seemed to pulse with a subtle, unseen energy. The lines on the paper were no longer inert representations, they felt like conduits, pathways for something to seep through from, elsewhere. I started wearing cotton gloves not just to protect the fragile documents, but to create a barrier, however flimsy, between myself and their unsettling potential. The minor anomalies I had been documenting escalated, their frequency and intensity growing. One morning, I arrived at the office to find my meticulously organized desk in disarray. Maps I had left neatly rolled were unfurled, their edges overlapping. My private notebook, usually locked in my drawer, lay open on my blotter, a fresh, spidery annotation in a brownish ink I didn't recognize scrawled in the margin beside my entry on Groon Lane. It wasn't in English, or any language I knew. It was a string of symbols, reminiscent of the scratches on the signpost, yet more complex, more fluid. I felt a surge of nausea, a violation. Something had been in my office, had touched my things, had read my thoughts. I reported the incident to Mr. Henderson, the chief archivist, a man whose world revolved around cataloging systems and conservation protocols. He listened with a frown, examined the strange annotation, and declared it must have been a prank by the night cleaners, or perhaps a vagrant who had somehow gained access. He promised to review security footage, though I knew the ancient CCTV system in our wing was notoriously unreliable. The strange ink, he dismissed as probably a spilled coffee stain, artfully rendered. But I knew. This was no prank. This was a response. My investigation, my persistent focus on Groon Lane, was drawing attention from whatever resided in those shadowed spaces. My attempts to find historical corroboration for Groon Lane, or the place of shadows, became more frantic. I delved into ecclesiastical records, parish council minutes dating back to the 17th century, even collections of local folklore and ghost stories. I found scattered, oblique references, tales of a whispering alley, where children were warned not to play after dusk, mentions of a green man's passage that was said to appear and disappear with the seasons, a chilling account from an 18th century diarist of a night watchman who claimed to have seen earthlights and heard unholy chantings emanating from an unlit snicket between Old Court and St. Mary's. The common thread was the elusiveness, the transience. These places were not fixed points on a map, they were fluid, appearing in one account, absent in another, their names and characteristics shifting like mist. It was as if Langereg possessed a hidden, secondary geography, a network of liminal spaces that flickered in and out of consensual reality. One evening, I was working late, trying to decipher a particularly dense passage in the 18th century diarist's account. The archive was silent, save for the hum of the climate control. Suddenly, the lights flickered, then died, plunging the vast room into absolute darkness. I froze, my heart leaping into my throat. A power cut? But the emergency lights, usually instantaneous, failed to illuminate. And then, in the oppressive blackness, I heard it. The rustling. Not from one direction, but all around me. The dry, papery sound of countless maps unrolling, of ancient parchments stirring, of unseen pages turning. It was accompanied by a chorus of faint whispers, sibilant and indistinct, seeming to emanate from the shelves themselves. The air grew cold, thick with the scent of centuries of accumulated dust, ink, and something else, that metallic tang again, sharper now. Panic seized me. I fumbled for my phone, its weak screen a feeble beacon in the overwhelming darkness. I tried to navigate towards the emergency exit, stumbling over a misplaced stool, my hands outstretched. The whispers seemed to follow me, growing louder, more insistent, as if trying to communicate, to impart some terrible, indecipherable knowledge. I reached the heavy fire door, my fingers scrabbling for the push bar. It yielded with a groan, and I burst out into the relative brightness of the corridor, where the emergency lights were working. I didn't look back. I fled the building, my breath sobbing in my chest, the sound of rustling paper and whispering voices echoing in my ears. The next morning, Mr. Henderson found me huddled in the staff kitchen, pale and trembling, clutching a mug of cold tea. The power, he informed me, had been off for less than 5 minutes, a minor trip at the local substation. The emergency lights in the archive wing had a faulty backup battery, scheduled for replacement. He looked at me with a mixture of concern and exasperation. "Alistair," he said, his voice gentle but firm, "you're working too hard. Burning the candle at both ends. Perhaps it's time you took some leave." I knew what he was implying. I was becoming unstable, unreliable. But how could I explain what I had experienced? The sentient rustling, the chorus of whispers from the shelves. He would think I was truly losing my mind. I agreed to take a few days off, a hollow acquiescence. But I knew I couldn't stay away. The archive, Langeregg itself, had become a puzzle I was compelled to solve, even if the solution threatened to consume me. During my enforced leave, I avoided the town center, the archive, the physical locus of Groom Lane. Instead, I walked the coastal paths, trying to clear my head, to reassert some semblance of normality. But even here, the strangeness followed. One afternoon, I was walking along a cliff path I knew well. It should have taken me 20 minutes to reach the old watchtower. It took nearly an hour. The path seemed to stretch, to meander in ways it never had before. Familiar landmarks appeared further away, or subtly out of place. It was the same temporal and spatial elasticity I had experienced before, but now infecting the wider landscape. I returned to my cottage, defeated. The unseen cartography was not confined to a single alleyway, or even to the archive. It was seeping into the very fabric of my world, rewriting its rules, its dimensions. And then, I remembered something. A detail from the 1650 Mappa Mundi of Langeregg town, the one that showed the locus umbrarum. In the elaborate cartouche, amongst the scrolls and decorative flourishes, the cartographer had included a small, almost hidden inscription, a quote in Latin. At the time, I had dismissed it as a typical pious sentiment of the era. Now, its words returned to me with chilling significance. Orbis non videtur, sed intelligitur. The world is not what is seen, but what is understood. Or perhaps, what is perceived. Was that the key? Was Langeregg's true geography, its hidden layers, not a fixed reality, but something shaped by perception, by belief, by the very act of trying to map it? And was my own increasingly obsessive understanding, my cartography of fear, somehow making these hidden spaces more real, more intrusive? The thought was terrifying. If the world could be reshaped by what I understood, what I feared, then I was no longer just an observer of the anomaly. I was becoming a participant in its creation, a co-author of Langeregg's unraveling. Chapter 5, The Bleeding Ink. The Latin inscription, Orbis non videtur, sed intelligitur, became my new mantra, a terrifying lens through which I now viewed every subtle shift, every inexplicable occurrence. If the world was shaped by understanding, by perception, then my own meticulous efforts to chart Langeregg's anomalies were not just acts of documentation, they were acts of invocation. The more I mapped the unseen, the more the unseen manifested. My enforced leave ended, and I returned to the archive with a mixture of dread and a perverse, almost defiant resolve. Mr. Henderson treated me with a careful, distant politeness, assigning me routine, mind-numbingly dull tasks, cataloging microfiches of council tax records from the 1970s, a task far removed from the alluring mysteries of antiquarian maps. He clearly hoped to bore the strangeness out of me. But the strangeness was no longer confined to the maps. It was in the air I breathed, in the familiar geometry of the office, which now seemed to subtly warp and shift at the periphery of my vision. Corridors would occasionally seem a fraction longer, doorways a touch narrower. The scent of old ink and damp earth would arise at unexpected moments, even in the modern, climate-controlled sections of the building. One afternoon, I was working with a large, linen-backed map of Langeregg from 1910, checking its condition before sending it for conservation. It was a beautiful piece of cartography, its colors still remarkably vibrant. As I smoothed out a crease, my finger brushed against a small, nondescript area near the old gasworks, an area that, on this map, was depicted as marshland. Suddenly, a vivid, overwhelming sensation. The smell of coal gas, acrid and cloying. The distant, rhythmic clang of industrial machinery. The feeling of damp, unstable ground beneath my feet. For a heart-stopping moment, I was there, in that Edwardian marshland, the grey Langeregg sky heavy above me. Then, as quickly as it came, the sensation vanished, leaving me gasping, my hand recoiling from the map as if it had been burned. I stared at the map, my heart hammering. The colors seemed brighter, the lines sharper, almost pulsating. Had the map shown me that? Or had my own overwrought mind, saturated with Langeregg's history, simply projected the sensation? The world is not what is seen, but what is understood. I understood the history of the gasworks, the marshland. Had that understanding briefly made it real? My private notebook filled with increasingly desperate entries, charting not just the external anomalies, but my own deteriorating psychological state. November 25th, sensory bleed through while handling 1910 OS map, gasworks/marshland area. Vivid olfactory, auditory, and tactile hallucination of historical environment. Duration, approximate 10 to 15 seconds. Extremely disorienting. Is the past becoming tangible through these documents? November 28th, persistent feeling of being watched within the archive. Shadows in peripheral vision seem to move. The rustling sound is now almost constant, a faint, subliminal whisper beneath the everyday office noises. Or am I imagining it? Sanity feels precarious. I became convinced that the archive itself was a kind of nexus, a place where Langeregg's many temporal layers were thinnest, most likely to bleed through. The sheer concentration of recorded memory, of attempts to fix the town in ink and paper, had somehow made it a focal point for the unseen cartography. And Groon Lane, or the place of shadows, was its dark heart. I found myself drawn back to the physical site, despite the terror it invoked. I had to understand the opening I had seen, the presence I had sensed. I went in broad daylight, hoping the mundane reality of a sunny afternoon would dispel the nocturnal horrors. The weedy patch was unchanged. The blank signpost stood its ground. I approached the concrete block wall, my breath catching in my throat. The dark opening I had seen beneath the ivy was still there, a narrow, shadowed slit. But as I peered closer, it seemed different. Smaller, perhaps. The edges less defined, as if the concrete itself were subtly flowing, trying to seal it. Or was it my perception, my fear, trying to minimize the threat? I reached out a trembling hand, touching the cold, rough concrete around the opening. And as my fingers brushed the edge, I felt it. A faint, almost imperceptible vibration. A deep, slow thrumming, like something vast and ancient breathing in the earth beneath my feet. And the ink. On the gray concrete, almost invisible against its weathered surface, were fresh marks. Not scratches this time, but what looked like smears of dark, viscous ink, as if someone, or something, had recently brushed against the opening, leaving traces of its passage. The ink was the same brownish-black as the strange annotation in my notebook. My blood ran cold. This wasn't just a passive anomaly. Something was moving between worlds, between layers, using these hidden pathways. And it was leaving its mark. I stumbled back, a wave of profound, existential dread washing over me. I was out of my depth, a cartographer of familiar landscapes suddenly confronted with a geography that defied all known principles, a geography that was actively, malevolently, interacting with me. That night, the phenomenon invaded my sanctuary. I was in my small living room, trying to distract myself with a book, when I heard a sound from the kitchen. A soft, wet, dripping sound. I frowned. A leaky tap. I'd had it fixed only last month. I went into the kitchen. The tap was dry. But the dripping sound continued, seemingly coming from the wall. The wall behind the sink, which backed onto the alleyway beside my cottage. As I stared, a dark stain began to appear on the faded floral wallpaper. It spread slowly, like a developing photograph, a patch of viscous, brownish-black liquid, the same color as the ink on the concrete, the ink in my notebook. It pulsed faintly, and from it, the dripping sound intensified. Then, the wallpaper began to peel away from the spreading stain, curling back like dead skin, revealing the damp plaster beneath. And on the plaster, a line was appearing. A thin, dark line, as if drawn by an invisible, spectral pen, moving slowly, deliberately, downwards. It was mapping itself. On my wall. I watched, frozen in terror, as the line extended, then branched, forming a crude, spidery symbol, the three jagged peaks, the off-kilter spiral. The sigil from the Groom Lane signpost, the ancient mark of pathways between worlds, now bleeding through the very fabric of my home. The dripping stopped. The stain remained, a dark, malevolent eye on my kitchen wall. The smell of old ink and damp earth was overpowering. I knew then that I could no longer be a passive observer, a mere documenter of anomalies. The unseen cartography was not just something to be studied, it was something that had to be confronted. The bleeding ink was a challenge, an invasion. My sanity, my home, my very understanding of reality, were under siege. And the only way to fight back, I suspected, was to understand the map that was trying to rewrite my world, even if that understanding led me into the heart of its terrifying, non-Euclidean darkness. The lines were being drawn, and I was caught, inextricably, within their impossible geometry.